Thank you for downloading the book from the free electronic library Royal Libru. http Royal Libru. All books by the author. http Royal Libru. Author Kremlev Sergius. HTML The same book in other formats. http Royal Libru. Book Kremlev Sergius. Россия I Germanium stili poroznь СССР Stalin I Reich Ghitlera. HTML Enjoy reading. Sergius Kremlev, Russia and Germany. Together or apart. Sergei Kremlev, Sergei Tarasevich Brezhkin, Ukrainian. Born on October 7, 1951 in Dnepropetrovsk in the family of a railway engineer. He graduated from high school in Kirk and the engine building department of the Kharkov Aviation Institute named after N.E. Zhukovsky by profession, rocket engine engineer. After serving in the coastal units of the Black Sea Fleet since 1978, an employee of the largest and oldest center for the development of Soviet nuclear weapons, the All-Union Scientific Research Institute of Experimental Physics in Arzamas 16, later the Kremlin, now Serov Nizhny Novgorod region. Now it is the Russian Federal Nuclear Center, All-Russian Research Institute of Experimental Physics, RFNCV. He took part in the development of thermonuclear charges and in 1981 participated in field tests at the Semipalatinsk test site. Since 1992, he has been an employee of the Department for Problem Analysis of Nuclear Weapons of the Russian Federal Nuclear Center (VNIF), as well as one of the deputy directors of the Institute of Strategic Stability of the Russian Ministry of Atomic Energy. Author of numerous publications on a wide range of socio-political topics and on conceptual problems of nuclear weapons. Co-author of the books with I. Nikitschek, Start to at a Simple Glance and XC Century. Will Russia have a nuclear weapons complex? The latter was published as the official publication of the State Duma of the Russian Federation, and the book with V.N. Mikhailov, Good or Evil? Philosophy of a Stable World. The author expresses deep gratitude to his colleagues at the Institute of Strategic Stability of the Russian Ministry of Atomic Energy and the director of this academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences Viktor Nikitovich Mikhailov for the constant and varied support of the author's work in the field of historical and military political analysis. From the author, the story of this book is as follows. At first I was interested in the circumstances and origins of the formation of the Germany-USSR conflict, but examining them in detail, I was forced to descend further and further along the time scale into the depths of time. From the early 30s to post-Versailles Weimar Germany and the semi-Trotskyist USSR of the early 20s, then to the Treaty of Versailles, the First World War, and then to its prehistory. While working on my Versailles, I wanted to give not an adventurous version of events but to restore a historical era as it unfolded in reality. What forces moved the world on the eve of the 20th century and at its beginning? Why did the First World War happen? Who is preparing such wars and why? How did Germany become the cash cow of Versailles? I wanted to explore these questions with logical precision and analytical impartiality, but at the same time in an original and exciting way, not shying away from sometimes almost detective-like situations and statements. I hope that this is how a thoughtful and inquisitive reader will see this book. What did its alliance with France and England become for Russia? Did German Emperor Wilhelm I want war? Who should Germany have been for Russia, an enemy or a partner and ally? What is the role of America and the Golden International of financiers in preparing for war? Is there much truth in the story of Lenin's seal carriage? And how did the results of the First World War prepare the conditions for the Second World War? A new look at the initial period of the formation of the world of the 20th century, at the prehistory, history and post-history of the Old War. This is the essence of my historical research from William's Versailles to Wilson's Versailles. Among the historical figures present on the pages of the book, there are both the well-known Nicholas E. and William E., Lloyd George and Clemenceau, Bismarck and U.S. President Wilson, and behind-the-scenes figures. The Grey Reverence of German Foreign Policy, Baron Holstein, an international arms dealer Basil Zakharov, the Grey Eminence from the United States, Colonel Mandelhaus, British Foreign Minister Sir Edward Grey, as well as financiers Witt and the Rothschilds, the head of the Jewish community of St. Petersburg, stoker of the cavalry barracks, Sergeant Major Oshansky, Russian military agent in Scandinavia and Paris, Count Ignatiev and many others are famous and unknown heroes of the era, heroes with and without quotes. In the 20s, he wrote his book Europe in the Age of Imperialism on the same topic, 1871-1919, academician Tarl. But I did not follow established patterns. However, I did not ignore them, but critically retort them. And at the same time, I tried to leave behind what made it possible to reveal the historical truth and not to correct it in any predetermined spirit, without striving for the laurels of Valentin Pichel, who overly fictionalizes the story, or Alexander Bushkov, who interprets it superficially. The author wanted to achieve lightness but not frivolity in the reader's perception of serious facts and assessments. Preface T225 Yashka, dear reader. After the publication of the book Russia and Germany, Playoff, from Williams Versailles to Wilson's Versailles, all readers are divided for me into two, although equally respected, but quantitatively unequal categories. The first is those who are already familiar with the story of the two Versailles I told. With a reader in this category, you can bow ceremoniously, "Hello, dear," or simply briefly say, "Hello, buddy," and immediately move on to a new topic. It's more difficult with the latter, that is with my new acquaintances and, I hope, friends who do not know the beginning of the topic and who only hold in their hands this new book about the destinies of Russia and Germany. And it is to them that the author must inform that he has long been attracted by the history of Russian-German and Soviet-German relations of the last 30 years of the 19th century and the first 40 years of the 20th century. While studying it, I was surprised at how cleverly, using the same scheme, two nations were brought to a cruel battle, whose natural destiny is not to mutually destroy and weaken, but to mutually complement each other. Alas, in fact, the peoples of Germany and Russia twice, with a gap of just over 20 years, looked at each other through the slits of rifle sights, panoramas of artillery guns, navigators' sights, through the periscopes of submarines. Why did this happen, and who was interested in it? In my first book, I answered these questions as best I could in relation to the era before and during the First World War. And now I will only briefly repeat my conclusions, asking forgiveness from the first category of readers for the forced repetition. Although, repetition, whatever one may say, is the mother of learning. And it's high time for us in Russia to truly learn the lessons of history, and really learn from them. So, with the First World War, in my opinion, everything happened the way it happened. First of all, because America's capital had to take the lead in the world, sharply weakening those two powers, each of which could become a formidable competitor for the United States. In the case of peaceful mutual cooperation, these powers, that is, Germany and Russia, in the future were almost guaranteed to secure a dominant position in a world structure where there could be no place for either Pan-Americanism or Anglo-Saxon domination. Yes, in those days it was beneficial for many to pit Russia and Germany, which were closely connected economically and politically, against each other. Play off, in order to then involve them in a mutual war of extermination. To do this, they had to constantly quarrel, at the same time drawing Russia into an absolutely unfavorable alliance with France and later fastening it to the Anglo-French Entente. Having brought Russia and Germany into conflict over time and involving almost all of Europe in it, America could wait for the mutual exhaustion of European competitors and then directly intervene in the war going on in the fields of the Old World, finish off Germany and dictate its will to it. Beaten half to death, the European allies of the United States would also find themselves on a short leash with Uncle Sam. As it was planned, so it was done. However, in historiography it was generally accepted, and many still believe, that the First World War was programmed by Anglo-German rivalry, colonial and naval. For example, Stalin, who was more than knowledgeable about politics, nevertheless wrote in 1925 in his work On the Road to October. Already at the beginning of the 20th century, Germany and Japan jumped so far that the first managed to overtake France and began to push England aside in the world market, and the second, Russia, From these contradictions, as we know, the recent imperialist war arose. But England in the 20th century one way or another became an outsider, not to mention France. Germany took the leading role, developing powerfully and harmoniously, achieving success in all areas, from education and improving the well-being of the people to the acquisition of colonies almost peacefully. Russia, even after the unsuccessful Russo-Japanese War, was still invincible in a purely defensive war. And if she had secured peace and neutrality in the event of any European conflict with a strong alliance with Germany, and only Germany, and at the same time seriously dealt with internal problems, she could have reached at least the third position in the world after Germany and the United States. So that such, as they say now, virtual world of the 20th century does not become a reality, and the First World Massacre takes place in Europe. I also described its progress in the first book. Of course, not in detail, but only from the perspective that was needed to correctly highlight the era as a whole. After the Paris Peace Conference and the conclusion of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the United States, outwardly neutral, not even included in the post-war League of Nations, almost completely controlled its previously allied capitalist Europe. Germany at that time lived under the sign of two economic plans of two experienced pilots on the ship of the new American empire, Dawes and Young. Having become the cash cow of Versailles, Germany, however, did not accept the role assigned to it and quickly restored its economic potential. After the First World War, the Germans had very little gold, but they retained intelligence, skill and hard work, combined with experience and developed German industry. It was hardly possible to count on the fact that Germany would always remain a politically minor power. The Treaty of Versailles crushed the Germans, but it also, after squeezing out the first tears, thickened the German national character, made it stronger and thereby strengthened traditional German nationalism. In 1923, the beer hall putsch between Hitler and Ludendorff failed in Munich, but the ideas of Hitler and other nationalists, for example Alfred Hugenberg, not only did not depreciate in the eyes of the German masses, but over the years their influence only expanded. The future of the Weimar Republic was shrouded in fog. The contours of its future relations with Russia were also unclear. However, the mutual economic interests of Russia and Germany were so great that they determined not only an increase in economic exchange, but even very serious cooperation in the sphere of both the military industry and purely military ties between the Reichswehr and the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. Over Russia, which emerged half destroyed from the imperialist and civil wars and since December 1922 was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the red flag was flying and unprecedented social transformations were carried out there. At that time, two main currents of thoughts and sentiments were fighting in the country. Supporters of the first, our revolutionary romantic, proclaimed, "We will fan the world fire to the grief of all bourgeois." Those who chose the second, sober and practical, understood that we were far behind advanced countries and this distance must be covered in a matter of years. Otherwise we will be crushed. The first considered the USSR as the basis for a future world revolution and were ready to sacrifice the interests of the real Soviet Union in the name of the interests of the future world proletarian republic of the Third Communist International. The latter thought exactly the opposite, viewing the growing world communist movement as, first of all, a means of strengthening the external positions of the Soviet Union. Supporters of the first trend were not very concerned about the future of Russia, since they considered it impossible to build socialism in it without the help of the future proletarian republics of the West. Therefore, the leaders and ideologists of the first movement did not really want to engage in the tedious everyday work associated with the development of the Russian economy. And, as a rule, they weren't very good at it. Those who made up the second trend thought specifically, without large-scale industry, Soviet Russia would not last long, because without large-scale industry there is no strong defense, and, as Lenin used to say, any revolution is only worth something if it knows how to defend itself. However, let us note in parentheses that these same words are true not only for any revolution, but also for any power that has the slightest respect for itself. and the leaders of the second current moved from the tasks of the world revolution increasingly to the tasks of industrial reconstruction of Russia, and had not only the taste for solving such problems but also the ability. The first current is Trotsky, Zinoviev and their comrades. The second movement after Lenin's death was led by Stalin. For the first movement, Germany was a field for applying their revolutionary energy, and they calmly looked at the fact that the Comintern from Moscow was preparing a revolution in Berlin. More precisely, they didn't look, they prepared it. For the second trend, the German Soviet Republic would also, of course, be a preferable option, but Stalin already understood that it was almost unrealistic. Unlike Trotsky, Tukhachevsky and even Lenin, Stalin was skeptical about the prospects for the creation of Soviet Poland. He was also quite restrained on the German issue. Therefore, Stalin was inclined towards normal interstate communication between Russians and Germans. Not only the fate of the two countries but also the fate of the world and war in general depended on which ideas would become dominant, that is, state ideas in post-Versailles bourgeois Germany and in the proletarian Soviet Union, just as it was during the times of the Russian Empire and the German Reich. Looking ahead, I will say that with Hitler coming to power in Germany, this dilemma did not disappear but became even more acute. I decided to describe how Soviet-German relations developed in the 20-30s of the last century in my study entitled The Kremlin Visit of the Führer. I have long been driven by the desire to see what would have happened if Stalin had invited Hitler to Russia and he would have accepted such an invitation. That is, at first I wanted to write a novel in the popular and, in my opinion, in principle, with certain approaches, systemically valid genre of virtual history. But very soon, instead of writing such a novel, I was carried away by the idea of giving first a picture of the real European history between the two world wars, or more precisely, to consider those fragments of it that relate, first of all, to Germany and the USSR, to their internal post-war life and to their mutual connections. It was from such aspiration that the book Russia and Germany, Together or Separate, came about. The events in it end with 1933, the first year of Nazi power in Germany, at the beginning of which the Reichstag, set on fire on a February night, burst into flames, and at the end, in December, the Leipzig trial in the case of the February arson ended. The period from 1934 to 1939 should become the topic of the third book, tentatively entitled Russia and Germany, The Path to a Pact, but I do not intend to abandon the virtual continuation of the topic. Therefore, I took the liberty of announcing the future virtual turn of the novel research with the chapter prose which I called Zero. I also found it useful in a separate first chapter to share with the reader my thoughts about real, virtual and rational history, as well as explain my vision of some events from this angle. In the third book, Russia and Germany, The Path to the Pact, I hope to complete my story of real history, reaching the beginning of the Second World War, that is, the fall of the internally rotten, ugly brainchild of Versailles, Sanation Poland. But in the fourth book, the real course of events should end at the end of the autumn of 1940, and the further narrative will gradually be increasingly filled with virtually rational details, in order to then move on to the period of rational history. What is meant by this, reader learns, I repeat, from chapter 1. Moreover, all the figures, facts, data and historical details until the autumn of 1940, that is, before the Führer's first Kremlin visit, are basically documentary and truly historical, with the exception of one thing. The real Chkalov died in December 1938, and the rational one survived and became People's Commissar of Internal Affairs instead of Beria. However, this is not entirely fiction. The fact that Stalin stubbornly wooed Chkalov into party and state work is known quite well. But which one? This is what I read back in the 70s while studying at the Kharkov Aviation Institute, in the excellent book of memoirs of test pilot Igor Ivanovich Shelest, Flying for a Dream. Shelest was well acquainted with the old test pilot Alexander Petrovich Chnovsky, a friend of Valery Chkalov, and another outstanding test pilot Alexander Anisimov, and one day Chnovsky, in the mood, told Shelest how Chkalov, also in the mood, admitted to him and Anisimov that Stalin had just offered Chkalov a very responsible position. Chnovsky made a long pause and Celeste could not stand it. Valerie never told you what they wanted to entrust to him. Said, what? You know what, if I tell you this now, you won't believe it anyway. So let me say no more. What kind of proposal was this? I thought about Chnovsky's story more than once, and in the end I came to exactly the conclusion that I later used for the purposes of the novel. Yes, I found it possible to decipher it exactly like this. Time passed, and somehow I came across a publication where the Chkalovsky version was confirmed, seemingly documented. Then they told me that there was a television program about the same thing. It turns out, dear reader, that even without documents, I hit the mark. This was not just pleasant for me, I was once again convinced that the method of psychological substitution of oneself in the place of the participants in those events gives quite fruitful results. I would like to emphasize that in this and subsequent books, the dialogues of historical figures, especially before the period of the first visit, are developed on the basis of documents. And here I relied primarily on the multi-volume but small circulation publication of the USSR Ministry of Foreign Affairs Documents of Foreign Policy of the USSR, which appeared at the turn of the 60s and 70s. Reading and, of course, studying these volumes of official diplomatic correspondence, ambassadorial reports and other things captivated me no less than the novels of my favorite Dumas, Sabatini and Stevenson. I turned memos and memoirs into dialogues, and at the same time I sometimes had to make minor and therefore, I hope, completely forgivable rearrangements, putting MacDonald's words into Halifax's mouth, etc. After the autumn of 1940, the real story in my narrative will begin, as has already been said, to be gradually replaced by the rational one, and many real details will receive new coverage. For example, Canaris actually presented the Führer with a memorandum on March 1, 1941 on the state of affairs in the economy of the USSR and in the Red Army. But the fate of the memorandum and Canaris himself will turn out differently for me. How? Well, I've already said more than I should have about things that exist only in preliminary materials or in plans. In the meantime, we are still in the early 20s and will move from them to the 30s. By God, this time in itself is worth writing about and understanding. So, careful and, I hope, interesting reading to you, my dear and respected reader. Sergei Kremlev, Sergei Brezhkan, 0 hours 55 minutes December 22, 2002, 21:25 March 29, 2003 Chapter 0. Froze on June 21, 1941 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Eva Braun, happy and tanned, went ashore in the area of Cape Froze. An excellent athlete, she is accustomed to the cold, shallow waters of the Baltic, and now the Black Sea has captivated her as soon as she first entered its greenish waters a week ago. Somewhere there on the right hand was the white stone capital of the Russian fleet, Sevastopol. This morning they saw her with the Führer only from the sea, when the leader of the Moscow, with them on board, passed through a long bay that went deep into the shore. On the other side of Froze began a zone of bright, toy-looking resort villages. And if you raise your head up, the whiteness of the ancient Froze church immediately caught your eye. And everything here was cheerful, dazzlingly white under the bright, peaceful summer sun. The Führer, dressed in a white shirt and trousers made of the finest linen, sat on a chaise lounge and smiled, looking at Eva, spectacular in an open swimsuit. However, she was always spectacular, but he very rarely saw her so natural and joyful. It was clear that Hitler, too, relaxed. For the first time in many years he found himself in a completely unusual state. He felt himself not an outcast from society, not an unrecognized genius of architecture, not a lonely dreamer in the semi-darkness of a front-line dugout, not a political fighter, always ready to clang his teeth like a wolf, a loner, and not an adored leader and father of the nation. Now he was simply not very young, but full of strength, a man who suddenly felt that happiness was possible. The Führer only arrived here yesterday on a Russian Air Force plane from Moscow after tedious conversations with Stalin. Despite his habit of flying over Germany, the flight through Russia stunned him. It turned out to be an event in itself and was not at all like a German-European flight over the striped fields and anthills of peak towns. The silver, comfortable PS-84 and its two engines were made in Russian factories under an American license from Douglas. However, the Russians carefully recalculated the American design according to their strength standards and it became a little heavier but even more reliable. The Russians managed to convert other people's drawings to their technology and at the same time all inch dimensions into millimeters. Before the flight, a handsome Russian aircraft designer with the unpronounceable surname Myasishchev told the Führer about this in good German. Not boastfully, but clearly proud of his work, Myasishchev remarked, "Your Fokker and the Japanese Mitsubishi also purchased a license for this aircraft, but they were unable to fully master the technology and are only assembling them from units brought from the USA. It was amazing." The Russian was able to emphasize his superiority in such a way that Hitler did not have a feeling of irritation or hostility. The Russian did not want to hurt or offend. Hitler would have been glad to get angry and retreat into his usual arrogance, but it didn't work out. In this strange Russia, everything turned out somehow wrong. Not like in Europe and with Europeans. And the Führer had already begun to get used to it. Here is this Russian. It was clear that he was talking about the reliability of the aircraft not because he had the task of demonstrating the achievements of the Russian aircraft industry. He just wanted the guest to feel confident and not worry during the flight. Hitler recalled saying casually in response, "Oh, Herr Msishev, you are trying in vain to calm me down. I'm an old airwolf. I've already flown hundreds of hours. A passenger, of course." And he noted with satisfaction that the Russian was sincerely surprised. "Hundreds of hours?" He asked again and added, "But not every aviation general in our country has such a raid, at least as a passenger." But Hitler was even more surprised by the chief pilot of his plane, Colonel Golovanov. At first, Hitler wanted him to fly in Russia with his personal pilot, Captain Hans Bohr. However, the commander of the Russian Air Force, General Reich, with 2 gold stars on his chest, who was present at the farewell conversation with Stalin, shook his head and said that he guaranteed safety only with Soviet crew. Reich was a young, stocky guy who didn't have much control over his feelings and looked from under his brows. However, there was a reason for this. Just recently, in May, Hitler issued an order purely in his own style. The romance with the Russians was in full swing, and the Führer sincerely hesitated as to which continuation he should choose. However, as he had done more than once, he took a risk. Luftwaffe Major Otto Kranz took off his Junkers 52 from the Berlin Tempelhof airfield and, landing in the Polish general government, set off from a simple field airfield and headed for Moscow. 4 hours later, Kranz landed where the Führer and Göring ordered him, at the Moscow Central Airfield near the Dynamo Stadium. And if 8 Russian fighters had not been flying next to him for the last half hour like tethers, and the representative of the German embassy had not been languishing for an hour in the awkward wait at the airfield control tower, General Reich clearly would not have had to look at the Führer, even if only gloomily. Such failures were not forgiven in any state, and especially not in Stalin's Russia. Hitler understood this, and so did Reich, who was also aware that such an air voyage could only take place with the sanction of the Führer personally. So the young Russian general did have reason to be sulky at him. Moreover, Kranz a week later handed over by the Russians to the ambassador in Moscow, von der Schulenburg, returned to Berlin with a badly damaged face. Before getting off the plane in Moscow, he slammed his mortal flask and went down to the Russian concrete block, already very tipsy. Then, strictly according to the instructions, he first addressed those around him in his own way and for a long time could not understand that he was not in Berlin. The cover legend for the flight was the masterly aerial hooliganism. Like, he got very drunk, decided to fly from Poland to Berlin and lost his orientation exactly 180 degrees in reverse. As Kranz later learned from this same Reich, he was taken from Warsaw. They drove carefully, so that he discovered the escort only on the outskirts of Moscow when he was pressed closely. Reich, out of completeness of feeling, slapped Kranz in the face, saying, And you will report to Göring that you broke your face when, with drunken eyes, you slammed into the concrete. Do you understand? Hitler and Göring, listening to Kranz and looking at his offended and taped-up face, could not help laughing, and then Hermann abruptly said, "Well, Otto, you have to forgive this Russian. If you had been luckier, he would have already been shot." Kranz received the Knight's Cross, and the Führer realized that the Russians were becoming sharper and more vigilant despite the vastness of the novel. Or maybe that's precisely why. But this didn't irritate him, but forced him to take an unusual line of thinking. Reichegov's gloominess from yesterday also did not irritate him, but rather amused him. And Hitler was increasingly overwhelmed by the feeling that a major, decisive turn in his fate was approaching. For a long time now he had not habitually separated himself from the fate of Germany. Does this mean that Germany also had to prepare for the turn? The pact with the Russians, signed 2 years ago in Moscow by Ribbentrop, changed a lot. The Führer knew that in the Third Reich, still inherited from the Second Reich by Willy I, there were many supporters of Bismarck's concept, "Don't fight with Russia," and even more so, "Don't fight on two fronts." Therefore, not everyone perceived the pact as a tactical move. There were also those who would like it to be consolidated. What to choose? His whole being resisted sincere friendship with Russia. Moreover, with Communist Russia. But the more he got to know these Russians in their own country, the more he realized that there was no smell of subhumans here. But the Russians were very different from the standard European. There, in Europe, anywhere, from a Viennese cafe to the salon of Madame Ernst-Stengel or the halls of the Munich conference, the theatrical behavior of others seemed not only normal, but practically the only possible line of behavior for anyone who occupies any prominent position in public life. Position. Not only theater and film stars played, not only secular beauties and absolutely dazzling semi-secular beauties. Financiers and politicians played, Mussolini played, Daladier and Chamberlain played, Fat Herman and even the taciturn Bormann played. And in Russia, he observed generals, ministers, strangely called people's commissars and major engineers, and all of them were completely devoid of any posture. Everyone was who they were. Even those dozens of simpler Russians who fell within the scope of his visit. The clarity of service, the communication between subordinates and superiors was reminiscent of the best Prussian examples, but in this very clarity there was not a desire to please, but a consciousness of the importance of the work being performed. These people were not trying to feign false enthusiasm. They were polite but reserved, but in them, even in the security officers, one could see a sincere desire to understand who has come to them now and is traveling around the country. An enemy pretending to be a friend, or a former enemy who decided to become, if not a friend, then a partner. And more often, the Führer's internal reactions began to surprise him. They became more and more simple and human. This second visit to Moscow in the last 8 months was unofficial, like the first, and he took with him only a small personnel staff and a technical communications team. This also allowed him to be himself, although Hitler mentally grinned. It was precisely here that he remained less and less the himself to which he was accustomed and whom he knew well. Perhaps the thought of Eve also helped. When Molotov, during his next visit to Berlin, proposed this week-long visit vacation to the Führer, he at first openly, without holding back, laughed. "Herr Molotov, you yourself understand perfectly well that your proposal is as tempting for me as it is impossible to implement. I am still under the impression of my first visit to Russia, but I have so many things on my hands that my permanent stay here is absolutely necessary. You are happy people, you have peaceful problems, but here we have war. After all, you won't win it for us." Or, Hitler paused significantly. However, Molotov was silent, looked without blinking, and calmly waited for the continuation. Hitler again, this time with an effort, squeezed out a laugh and continued, "Or, can we win it together?" The question was asked directly, and although the Reich Chancellor tried his best to give it a humorous character, he clearly hinted that the Russian could understand what was said in the way that was most convenient for him. Maybe as a joke, it is possible, as a hint, you can, as a suggestion. Hitler was silent. Molotov was also silent. Hitler was waiting. Damn it. Sometimes the silence is significant, sometimes it is contemptuous, sometimes it is stupid. With Molotov, the silence was silent and nothing more. Hitler himself possessed large reserves of endurance when necessary, and therefore I could not help but admire my interlocutor, who, it seemed, had simply inexhaustible endurance. Without any specific reserve, out of nowhere, Hitler suddenly had an unexpected thought. Maybe I should ask him to give me a couple of lessons in silence. Strange, but she was amused. Although the Führer was not going to demonstrate his gaiety in any other way, neither natural nor forced. The pause hung so that a little more, and it could have brought down the whole conversation. But then Molotov moved slightly in his chair, as if erasing the silence with this slight movement, and without a direct connection with the question, as always, calmly answered, Herr Chancellor, we treat your problems with full understanding. However, and here the monolithic Molotov suddenly had a clearly slight twinkle in his eyes, we are now establishing good and even trusting relationships. Their volume is growing, and their depth may also increase. Molotov also paused meaningfully and continued. This summer the weather is excellent, stable, and you could not only spend a few days in negotiations but also relax a little away from your usual surroundings. I have for you a personal letter from Comrade Stalin on this matter. Having opened the package given to him by Molotov before starting to write the German text, Hitler carefully peered at the handwritten original. It was the first time he held Stalin's autograph in his hands. The handwriting was large, clearly legible, confident and sweeping at the same time. The Führer involuntarily lingered on the text, trying to catch the general tone from the visual impression. The letter inspired confidence, and Hitler turned his gaze to the typewritten translation. During our first acquaintance, Stalin wrote, we talked about how useful it would be for you to become more closely acquainted with our country. However, at that time the active phase of hostilities in Europe limited your capabilities in this direction, Mr. Reich Chancellor. The current period is characterized by a certain calm. At the same time, Soviet-German relations have become increasingly widespread over the past year, and we could significantly diversify them. Vyacheslav Molotov, like me, believe that this is the right time for you to come to Moscow for new personal negotiations. Summertime also provides an excellent opportunity to get to know the Moscow region and its architectural ensembles, which, it seems to me, would be especially interesting for you. Vyacheslav Molotov has the authority to discuss all specific details if he receives your consent. Hitler looked at the date under the signature, May 28, 1941, and thought, it seems that the Russians were inviting him to a new tour, and the fact that this letter, Stalin's second personal message, arrived almost immediately after the adventure with Kranz's flight said that there could be something serious here, and the unusual sparkle in Molotov's eyes was also worth something. Himself a subtle psychologist and actor, Hitler knew how to notice and appreciate nuances. And then he saw that Molotov was not playing, but simply deliberately allowed himself to relax a little and open the visor of impenetrable restraint that suited him so well. Molotov precisely caught the moment when it was possible to interrupt another long pause and said clearly memorized words in poor but legible German. Herr Chancellor, I would like to say a few words to you face to face. And then he pointed to a small sofa standing against the wall. Intrigued, Hitler rose from his seat and waved his hand at Molotov in invitation. They approached the sofa, and there Molotov, sitting on the edge and looking Hitler straight in the eye, quietly said in the same memorized, bad German, we hope to be understood correctly. And we sincerely invite Fräulein Eva Braun, who could come a little earlier and relax for a few days in Crimea at a secluded government dacha. We would be happy to host you there at the end of your visit. Hitler was stunned, and conflicting feelings literally exploded within him, but he restrained himself. However, the storm was raging. These Russians were unceremoniously invading his privacy. What do they allow themselves? Or is this a hint at how well Russian intelligence works? After all, few people even know about Eva in Germany. But how can one so carelessly put all relations with Germany at stake? Or do they not understand that the Reich today is him, Hitler? Once upon a time, Louis Ziv, surrounded by court shufflers from Versailles, boasted, the state is me, the boast of a crowned slacker. But he, the Führer, really became engaged to Germany, and therefore he is its master by right of his heart's choice. The boys of the Hitler Youth look at him with burning eyes. The grey-haired generals, albeit by far not all, honestly recognize his superiority, and this cast iron people's commissar. But at the same time curiosity emerged and irritated. Why did a seemingly small, insignificant detail with Eve suddenly arise? And this was not an impromptu action, but a pre-thought-out action, and clearly by Stalin himself. What is its meaning? Molotov looked quite friendly and understanding, and suddenly a thought, simple in its improbability, occurred to Hitler. Molotov and Stalin want to make it clear to Hitler that they are interested in him not only as the leader of the new Germany, but also as a person, that they are ready to go far in their partnership. He recalled Ribbentrop's enthusiastic reaction when he returned from Moscow at the end of August 1939 after the conclusion of the pact. Ribbentrop then forgot Talleyrand's warning that one should be afraid of the first impression because it is sincere. Ribbentrop sincerely admired the simplicity and cordiality of the atmosphere in Stalin's circle. And Hitler, also looking Molotov straight in the eyes, said, "Dank, I will come to Russia." And Fräulein Braun too. Despite the fact that this was said in German, Molotov understood and answered briefly in German. Gut. Hitler remembered all this now and thought with satisfaction that he had not made a mistake. The current meetings with Stalin could indeed become a turning point. Something began to happen the first time when he decided to go to Moscow at Stalin's invitation almost immediately after Dunkirk in November 1940. Considerable changes occurred after that, but it was possible to turn sideways or even turn back at any moment. Turn and then turn around again to face Russia and strike. In the Oberkommando Wehrmacht, they began working on Barbarossa in the same late autumn of the 40s, and they are still working to this day. In fact, plus 10 days readiness has already been achieved. Now he found himself at a crossroads like that Russian knight whose image was shown to him in a Russian art gallery. But you need to think about this carefully at home. In the meantime, he was still at the mercy of emotional impressions so important for him in his subsequent rationalistic actions. The simplicity and warmth of the Russians had a surprisingly beneficial effect, and these streams of natural simplicity, which surrounded him not for the first day, eroded the weariness of his entire life. Instead, there was anticipation. However, the alertness did not give up so easily. In Moscow, on the eve of the flight here, he insisted that the plane on which he was to fly was checked in flight personally by Bohr. Reichgov immediately agreed to this. Bohr flew around the plane with Golovanov and was completely satisfied. Simple and pleasant, my Führer. I don't know if every Russian copy is so good, but this one is obedient and reliable. There is no need to interfere with his flight, and you will fly where you wanted. And the pilot, Hans? Hitler asked. My Führer, Bohr replied, even though I will also be on the plane, we will have no problems with this pilot. The spitting image of Göring in his youth. He hesitated and still added, only more beautiful. When Colonel Golovanov appeared before Hitler the next day, he understood why faithful Hans hesitated. The first thought was, if only someone could be the personal pilot of the Führer of the German people. With his courageous, cut-out face, Golovanov really resembled the young Göring, but there was nothing in him of the proud and predatory tenace. He was a pure Nordic type of the ancient Viking, the Nibelung. He smelled of Wagner. Bohr was, of course, a virtuoso, but it was impossible to compare him short, baggy, plump and this stately northern handsome man of guard's height and stature. Involuntarily it burst out. Where are you from, Colonel? From Gorky. This is an ancient city on the Volga, previously called Nizhny Novgorod. What about nationality? A natural hair, Volgar. Like Chkalov, the name Chkalov had special meaning for Hitler. He knew that this Russian, famous for his non-stop flight to America via the North Pole, was Stalin's favorite. Then he got into a serious accident, was near death but survived, and Stalin, unexpectedly for everyone, made him his people's Commissar of Internal Affairs. In the Reich, this was Himmler's post, and he was already telling the Führer about his Russian colleague. Moreover, without the usual dispassion, Henry believed that Chkalov was a serious problem. Moreover, for some reason Chkalov was in absentia sympathetic to Göring. Perhaps this was due to the pilot's interest in the pilot. During Hitler's last visit, Chkalov was not in Moscow, but this time Hitler saw Chkalov briefly and considered it possible to inquire, "Do you know Chkalov well?" "No, not really. But I've seen him fly more than once." "And how does he fly?" "Smart and fearless." 37-year-old Golovanov, chief pilot of the Civil Air Fleet, fought at Khalkhin Gol and flew on the Finnish front. He wore a badge on his chest for flying 1,000,000 kilometers and performed particularly important flights. The plane was piloted just like Bohr, that is, completely unnoticed by the passengers. Hoffmann flew with Hitler. He couldn't help but take a photographer on such an important trip, and so an old acquaintance of both the Führer and Eva sat nearby and from time to time clicked his camera when picturesque landscapes appeared in the windows of the plane. The plane flew low at just a kilometer altitude and sometimes deliberately descended lower. The Russians in civilian clothes but with the familiar smartness of security officers glanced sideways at the Führer's personal photographer but did not interfere with taking pictures. Obviously, the route was laid out in such a way that Canaris could not get anything from Hoffmann's studies. There was only one landing in Kharkov, over which Golovanov, at the request of the Führer, made a couple of wide circles. But even here, by the way, without hesitation, immediately Golovanov fulfilled his request. It was clear that this possibility had also been foreseen in advance. And behind such careful forethought, combined with helpful courtesy, Stalin's style was felt. Summer Kharkov, even from the air, looked picturesque and bright, especially its center with the golden domes of preserved ancient churches and another cathedral, the Annunciation Cathedral, colorful, built in a pseudo-Byzantine style. People's Commissar Tevosian told the Führer this. He worked in Germany for a long time and spoke German well. Tevosian knew Krupp and amused the Führer with stories about how he, Tevosian, who received the nickname Schwarz-Ivan from Krupp for his dark hair, was persuaded to stay at Krupp's factories and even wooed a luxurious blonde. Hitler openly laughed at Krupp's attempts to use the Frau factor in relations with the Russian Bolsheviks, and Tevosian sarcastically remarked, "Were you already married then?" "Then, not yet." "What kind of word party is it in Russian?" "Female." "Well, you should kiss your blonde. This is not prohibited in Germany." And then they would calmly leave. Or were they afraid that this would be a betrayal of the party? Tevosian comically puffed up his black mustache and jokingly admitted, "No, I was afraid that I wouldn't even notice how I would drown in the blonde waves." After Kharkov, Hitler laughed again. The Russian flight attendants, both with straw crowns of heavy hair with busts of Valkyries and a funny German accent, suddenly began to be very slightly but persistently interested in Hoffmann and his camera. They clearly wanted to get a photo as a souvenir, and Hoffmann, who had long since reached his sixth decade, did not want to miss the opportunity for light flirtation. They were carried away by some kind of mutual negotiations, and the Führer grinned and glanced at Hoffmann melting in front of the Slavs. Suddenly Tevosian leaned towards Hitler, nodded his head out the window and for some reason said in a low voice, "Herr Chancellor, obviously, you will be interested in seeing at least the Dnieper hydroelectric dam from above." Hitler quickly looked down and saw that they were flying above the ground only some 200 meters away. Golovanov lowered the car so smoothly that no one noticed it, including Hoffmann, who was always the first to rush to the windows in such cases. And below, at a cruising speed of 220 km per hour, a dam was already floating, throwing colossal masses of water from a height, and clouds of sparkling water dust stood above it. The sight was rare and majestic, and the angle was ideal for a high-quality reconnaissance photograph. Hoffmann finally noticed that the Führer was looking too enthusiastically and interestedly at something extremely interesting down there, and abruptly rushed to the porthole with an exclamation. "What is that there?" "Dnieper hydroelectric station," Tevosian answered loudly. The flight attendants smiled sweetly on the sidelines, and Hoffmann looked so confused that Hitler laughed and added, "Heinrich, although you are not Heinrich the bird catcher, you just caught a crow. Yes, the Russians knew how to be hospitable, open and secretive at the same time. And sometimes they discovered a subtle wit, as in that scene with Hoffman played out from the notes. The Emperor smiled again, remembering her, and turned his gaze to Eva, stretched out in the sun on a wide, low wooden trestle bed. She lay with her eyes closed, but feeling his gaze, she perked up and looked questioningly back. Well, are you happy that you ended up here? Yes, my Führer. It was wonderful, and now I see you again, and this is even more wonderful. They broke up with Eva a week ago in Ukraine, in Kyiv. He did not allow her to fly, and so she moved to a trailer carriage and was in froze within a day. During this time, they talked twice by radio telephone. Together with his personnel group, the Russians ensured stable communication with all subscribers in Germany and, of course, here. At any moment, from anywhere, Hitler could call those with whom he wanted to talk. During these days, he called the consuls of the newly restored German consulates in Kyiv, Odessa, Leningrad, Novosibirsk, and the heads of technical commissions working in Russia. When he spoke with Eva, even over the phone, it was heard that Eva was happy, and the Führer was grateful to the Russians for this. His Eva was not always so animated, and Eva really felt extremely good. She lived in the Berghof almost forever. The Führer did not want her to be an eyesore for Germany. Here, with the Russians in Crimea, she was also in solitude, but she was received so tactfully, without a shadow of idle curiosity, that Eva felt like a free bird already on the day of her arrival. Her only companion, whom she was introduced to back in Kyiv, was a plump, dark-haired, round-faced woman who spoke excellent German. Not in her early youth, she was very sweet and charming. She had an attractive, strong-willed face and called herself Emma. They swam, sunbathed, wandered through the mountains, ate crimean grapes and drank sweet, viscous old wines from the Massandra cellars. Before the Führer arrived, Emma kissed Eva, gave her a cute teddy bear and disappeared when the plane with the Führer was already landing. The plane entered from the sea and began to descend along the coast. Eve became scared. The mountains were so close and tightly pressed against the coastal edge here that it seemed as if the plane was about to collide with them. In fact, the runway was built into the rocky landscape in an industrious and safe manner. A minute later, and the plane was already taxiing towards Eva. The evening was wonderful. Hitler gave himself up to rest all the more willingly because he was tired in Moscow both from impressions and from work. He drank Narzan and Berzovskaya, which he liked on his first visit, ate Russian smoked sturgeon, okroshka, and joked a lot with Tevosyan and Hoffman. Early in the morning, he and the Russian People's Commissar, taking Eva and leaving Hoffman to sleep sweetly, went on a warship to Sevastopol. Hitler had rarely been to the sea, much less to the south, at such a beautiful time, and he fully appreciated the restrained brightness of the Black Sea landscapes floating on the starboard side. The mountain slopes overgrown with dense forest gave way to high and steep banks. At Cape Fiolent, a triangular cliff of a dark green color caught the eye, sharply different from the nearby rocks with a reddish and grey color. The leader walked at an average speed, and only when the commander of the Black Sea Fleet, Admiral Oktyabrski, a strong man with a bald head, invited the Führer and Eva to the bridge, the speed increased sharply. It became clear. The Russians were demonstrating the performance of their warships. The sailors sported a snow-white uniform with blue-collar lapels decorated with 3 white stripes. The officers are also in all white with daggers and white gloves. Even if the tall red navy men were selected specifically for this demonstration campaign, the Russian fleet had something to be proud of. Confident, black-tanned, athletically built, with teeth that seemed to complement their uniform, the Russian guys did not resemble the youth of the Hitler youth. There was no sophistication in them, but there was an unshakable love of life. The expressive faces of the German youths were relaxed, while the large faces of the Russians expressed strength and dignity. Hitler caught himself thinking, yes, if you push them, then my wolf cubs won't crash against these bears. I wonder how they would look not in opposition, but in complementing each other. Is Stalin really right after all? But can this confrontation be avoided? Before Sevastopol, the cruiser went further out to sea, and then turned towards the shore, and base began to approach them, a section of distant flat mountains on the left and thin columns of some ancient ruins on the right. In these places England and France once gained victory, but did not find glory. The glory went to the Russians. Hitler stood in the wind on the deck. Eva was nearby, and his thoughts flew there, to the city where only the Russians owned glory. The bay opened wide, but as it approached, it narrowed, and it seemed to Hitler that this was the path to Russia. It's easy to get in, it's not easy to get out, and there is a lot of glory along this path, but all of it belongs to the Russians. Here are the flights of white stairs running down to the sea, and above it is a double colonnade of the Doric order. And further, right in the water, there is an unusual-looking monument, and a shaven-headed Russian admiral explains that this is a monument to sunken ships. But why flooded? Monuments are erected to the winners, who announce their own and foreign shores with the roar of victorious fireworks. The Führer cannot stand it and tells the admiral about this. And he suddenly smiles slyly and answers, "In Sevastopol, Mr. Reich Chancellor, there is another monument beloved by Russian sailors, Lieutenant Commander Kozarsky, commander of the brig Mercury. This brig fought off a superior enemy and then escaped. On the monument it is written, for posterity as an example." Oktyabrski thought for a moment and then said with conviction, "Sometimes it's more important not to win than to give up," and his inexpressive, high cheekbone face becomes sculptural in an instant. Tevosyan, standing nearby, said thoughtfully, as if to himself, "Our Anusov believed that a steel cannon could save Sevastopol. But in Nikolaev, Russia, under Nesselrod and Kankrin, they did not listen to him. But your Krupp took into account the lessons of the Crimean War." Yes, Hitler agreed, and thanks to Krupp's steel cannon, we defeated the French at Sedan. The hint was clear. The French beat you here, and we beat the French. Tevosyan did not object and even confirmed, unlike us near Sevastopol. Then he added, "And the Tsarist government had to buy guns from Krupp. Is that so?" The Führer was surprised. This is an interesting detail. But you say, Admiral, Nesselrode, Kankrin. Are these Germans? Germans. Don't you think it's a little strange that yours Hitler emphasized this yours the Germans damaged Russia and our Krupp helped it? Tevosyan smiled. Yes, Mr. Reich Chancellor, Russian Germans were not always useful to Russia. There was the Great Catherine and there was also the insignificant Nesselrode. I thought a lot about this and I know one thing for sure. The historical destinies of Germany and Russia have been intertwined for a long time. The question is how to tie and untie these knots. And after a pause, he added, but we later learned how to make good steel cannons ourselves. And armor too. On the way back, time flew by, because half of it was spent having lunch in the war room, at the end of which Admiral Oktyabrski presented a pleasant surprise. On behalf of Comrade Stalin, allow me to present you as a gift as a souvenir of our campaign and the Black Sea this seascape by the artist Iwazowski and an officer's dagger. And we ask Fräulein to accept this modest gift. The Admiral took from the hands of the white-clad lieutenant a snow-white set of Russian sailor uniform with gold stripes on small square shoulder straps, an elegant cap and a wide leather belt with a burning gold badge decorated with an anchor. Eva was confused, but quickly overcame her excitement and looked questioningly at the Führer. He nodded condescendingly and answered for Eve, "Do you want, Herr Admiral, to hint by this that from now on I will be a prisoner of Russian sailors even within the walls of my own home?" "No, Herr Reich Chancellor, rather it means that Russian sailors are always ready to be near you." "Ooh. You had to keep your eyes open with these Russians." Stalin's admirals were precise and witty even in such details, and behind the speed of the answer one could still discern the same Stalinist will, and yet there was no sense of play behind it. It was another gesture, a demonstration of goodwill. A trifling illustration of serious conversations that needed to be thought about, but not now. Now I wanted to perceive only the external, visible side of things and postpone analysis until later. Already in froze, Eva, fooling around, began to change into the donated suit, and only then she discovered and triumphantly informed the Führer that it was made of fine linen, and the color, in appearance, was the same as that of the tanned red navy men, woven from beautiful dense lace. The last surprise was the plaque. It not only cast gold, but was also made of it. The day flew by unnoticed and was approaching sunset. There was no sense of time. I didn't want to recognize him, count him, measure him. And only out of inertia, Hitler languidly asked Eva, "What date is tomorrow?" 22nd, Eve answered a little surprised. How quickly time flies. June is almost over. I can't believe that in a day we will be back at the bug half. Chapter 1. About the history of real, virtual, rational. On the role of personality in history. And about Stalin's main mistake, what in honest historical research should be considered the most significant. Lenin's niece, Olga Dmitrievna Ulyanova, told me that she was once publicly asked, they talk either about Lenin's German or Jewish roots on his mother's side. Which option would suit you personally? And Olga Dmitrievna was not at a loss. I would be happy with the truth, and the truths of the past exist regardless of our desire. Yes, honestly researched history means not least of all accurate information and indisputable documents. When the record of the events of an era is complete and is at the disposal of the researcher, then his reconstruction of history is automatically true. Unless, of course, the researcher's goal is the truth and not its refutation. What if the record is not complete? What if we have no reliable facts at all? And if they exist, have we interpreted them correctly? Gilbert Keith Chesterton has a story from the Father Brown series, The Broken Sword. In it, the famous criminologist in a cassock restores the truth using, first of all, psychological analysis without refuting long-known facts. As a result, it turns out that General St. Clair, who allegedly fell heroically in the fight against enemies, was in fact a traitor, and he was hanged by his own soldiers. To the known facts, Father Brown added a sincere desire to find the truth and a couple of unknown facts, and everything changed fundamentally. But even if we have at our disposal a lot of historical facts and information, can we be sure that we understood history as it was created by the people who lived at that time? It would seem a simple question. Which period of history is more transparent for understanding, antiquity or the 20th century? What to think about here, the reader can immediately say, the ancient Greeks lived 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, and our time is outside the window. And then, how many reliable documents remain from the Greeks, from Rome? 3 or 4 bookcases are enough for everything. Well, there are still many stone inscriptions. There are so many of them that this is the most important source for the study of antiquity. Well, let there be a dozen more cabinets with volumes reproducing these inscriptions. And already the 18th century gives historians piles of archival papers. 19 mountains. In the 20th, archives form mountain ranges. So, it's easier to understand the events of the 20th century. Certainly. However, this is not quite true. Ancient society was generally simple-minded. Emperors, kings, tyrants, satraps, tribunes, consuls, generals and senators did not yet know how to deftly pretend either to each other or to the peoples. To deceive, to be cunning, yes, please. But serious multi-move combinations were impossible due to the snails, or rather, horses' speed of information exchange. Darius went to Greece with a clear and understandable goal, to conquer and rob. Alexander the Great crossed the sea to Asia for the same thing, although he covered up the goals of the campaign with words about revenge on the Persians for the desecrated shrines of Hellas. Deeply hidden motives. A complex diplomatic game. A campaign of disinformation in print or through intelligence channels. Looking for new markets or sources of cheap raw materials. My God, if there was something like this in ancient political life, it was in such an embryonic state that to our sophisticated minds these tricks of the ancients seem like the trick of a baby who hid his head in his mother's hem and is sure that now no one can see him cease. No, a document from that era is, as a rule, good evidence that helps clarify the essence of the matter. But our century is a continuous tangle of truth and deliberate lies. It's a gift that he leaves behind mountains of papers from every event. But the poor historian of the 20th century will be the one who begins to study, say, the political history of the 20s and 30s of the last century only from the records of official diplomatic negotiations, speeches of political leaders, materials of peace conferences and meetings of the League of Nations. He simply won't understand why suddenly wars, aggressions and carpet bombings became possible among such peace-loving states, one and all ready to begin general disarmament tomorrow. What about the social life of the ancients? And it was, of course, simple. The free Roman commoner really had enough bread and circuses, and the unfree slave was often satisfied with the fact that he was alive and not beaten. So the springs that moved people's lives in the past were not particularly complex and invisible. Even then it was easy to see them, and now even more so. Perhaps an enlightened reader will tell me, you, author, are behind the discoveries of the century. Already 3000 years ago, ancient Egyptian priests used secret knowledge to rule the world. Yes, and it was inherited from even more ancient sages. How did these secret magicians living on the Nile rule India, or, closer to home, Assyria? Through careers. At what speed? Well, with what then was it possible? With the speed of a horse galloping and a sail in the wind. What if the sail breaks? Either the horse died from such a race, or the courier fell into an abyss on a mountain path. And were there those paths then? No, the threads of controlling people became invisible later, when they really began to stretch throughout the world. And the closer we get to our days, the deeper, I repeat, they disappear into a boundless sea of paper, which increasingly often does not so much clarify the essence of the matter as hide it. Previously, the ends were hidden in water. Now, to the papers, to the documents, and increasingly, true motives and goals were not trusted not only on paper but even on lips. How many major events in our world have happened, are happening, and will happen, or will not happen, after just a wink from a few silent men sitting somewhere in cozy armchairs over cups of such selected tea that the entire vastness of China is capable of providing the world super elite with no more than 10,000 of them cups a year. An archived recording can be found or declassified, a conversation can be overheard and recorded. But what about a slight wave of the hand, or even just a movement of the lips, or a squinting of the eyes? How can we discern the true meaning behind events? How to understand, was this or that turn of events really inevitable? Couldn't something else happen in people's lives more intelligent, necessary and important than what actually happened? And here we cannot do without psychology. Psychological analysis, the attempt of a researcher to take the place of real historical figures the way a good novelist does. This is what today can often outweigh many, even formally reliable documents. Although this does not eliminate the need to familiarize yourself with the documents. The French historian Marc Bloch in the first chapter of his Apology of History has sections with good titles. Understanding the present with the help of the past and understanding the past with the help of the present. I think that if we did not have the opportunity to do both the first and the second with the help of history, then history would immediately become 10 times less interesting even for professionals. Bloch, being a medievalist historian, a specialist in the rather simple-minded Middle Ages, certainly appreciated the documents. However, these are his words. Gentlemen Robespierreists, anti-Robespierreists, that is, historians who justify Robespierre's policies and denounce them. SK. We ask for mercy. Tell us, for God's sake, simply, what was Robespierre like? Yes, knowing a person, you can understand his actions, which otherwise could be interpreted not only distorted, but completely wrong. And of course, in order to understand what has happened and what is happening, we must remember the words of Lenin. People will always remain stupid victims of deception and self-deception in politics until they learn to see the interests of certain classes and social groups behind every phenomenon of social life. However, smart people understood this a long time ago. Qui prodest, who benefits? The ancient Romans asked. Also a classic, by the way. And these two famous words put an end to such an interpretation of the development of society, which babbles about accidents, about heroes, about the chaotic nature of history. A truly bourgeois historian, at best, does not understand history. At worst, he deliberately falsifies it. The closer he is to understanding, the closer he is to Marxism, even if he himself may not realize it. However, classical Marxism also makes a serious mistake. He, without hesitation, always and in all years puts the economic factor in first place and takes into account the human factor only in second place. But history is made by living people. The one who hacks the destinies of millions with the stroke of a pen also has one liver spleen, just like the last poor, powerless poor fellow. So you are unlikely to understand the human world in its entirety if you describe and study only the historical process. And strangely enough, the closer we get to our century, the more often the thoughts, feelings and characters of not only the masses but also large publicly visible historical figures acquire more and more importance. The course of history sometimes began to depend on them more than on political economy. Yes, once upon a time the famous expression of Louis XIV echoed through the halls of the newly built Versailles. I am the state. But this catchy phrase only proves the arrogance and, frankly speaking, small intelligence of the Sun King. France was ruled, of course, not so much by him, and not even so much by the clever Colbert, but by the objective needs of society, albeit deformed by royal and aristocratic whims. However, sometimes they too reached their limits. The same Louis once had to curry favor with the tax farmer Bernard. That's absolutism. In the past we find, first of all, three impressive examples of the active and powerful influence of the individual on the era: Alexander the Great of Macedon, Napoleon Bonaparte and our Peter the Great. However, in the 20th century there are examples that suggest that the primary, sometimes importance of heroes is a feature of our century. To this day, the bourgeois historian is sure personality comes first, but economic relations cannot be discounted. That's understandable, the Marxist will grin. It is now impossible to explain the development of the world by the development of one world idea. But we need to start from the economy, from the basis. And personality is an important element, but a superstructural one. So, one says. And the economy is also important, the other. And the individual too. Although the debate about what is more important in our time, a historical figure or industrial relations, is a debate about which wing of the bird is most important. Is it possible to say? And the second wing is also important. Both wings are important because a bird cannot fly on one. Moreover, compared to our century, history used to crawl. But now for the first time he flies on two wings, economic and personal. Knock one wing and the bird of history will collapse. You can say it another way. In life, a stone flies in an arc, but in physics, the principle of superposition is accepted when a curve is divided into two straight lines, vertical and horizontal. In the textbook, on paper, the stone flies along these two straight lines. Along the horizontal one, under the influence of only the force of the throw. Along the vertical, under the influence of only the force of gravity. But in life both forces act simultaneously. This is how our age is. In it, strong or, on the contrary, powerless like Gorbachev or Yeltsin, leaders influence history on an equal basis with the economy. And sometimes personality outweighs. Of course, even the most potentially outstanding social reformer can actually become one only if his personal potential is in demand according to the prevailing historical conditions. But if the conditions are present but the personality is not present, then entire layers of the most important events may not be realized. If there is a personality, then she accurately grasps the essence of the situation and does what needs to be done to change history in the right, that is, in a creative direction. And this happens at the right time and in the right place. It was not for nothing that Trotsky believed that although the Great October Revolution had, in his opinion, two main leaders, he and Lenin, but if only Trotsky had been in St. Petersburg, there would have been no October. And if only Lenin, it wouldn't matter. For a pseudo-Marxist this is heresy to this day. But this is true. History does not move in straight lines from a physics textbook. It is flexible, like the arc of real flight, and it is increasingly the leader who bends it, and not historical necessity itself. Following pure Marxism, even such a brilliant expert on the Napoleonic era as academician Evgeny Viktorovich Tarl, who confidently stated that Napoleon treated soldiers as cannon fodder, could be mistaken in assessing the role of personal qualities in the formation of an era. A soulless, so to speak, protege of the new bourgeoisie. A protege is a protege. But it is unlikely that the soldiers would have loved their emperor passionately and devotedly. They would hardly have followed him far away if Napoleon had not loved them, loved from the heart and sincerely. Due to the simplicity of his soul, a soldier will forgive a lot of things but not falsehood. He will recognize her quickly, he will not miss her and will not forgive her. But maybe Napoleon was pretending too cleverly for 2 decades. No, it doesn't work. And therefore Napoleon and his influence on his time cannot be understood unless one sees that the Emperor of the French is a complex product of the action of different but equally important forces. He is, yes, a protege of capital, but he is also the chosen one of the all-powerful and mutual soldier's love. If there had been only capital or only love, the great Napoleon would hardly have happened. Yes, Marxists Marx and Engels, Marxist Lenin, Marxist Stalin were firmly convinced that in the final analysis the economic side of the matter is the main one, and the human side is also important. Also is one short word, but having nestled in the views of Joseph Stalin, it perhaps cost humanity a golden age, which could have become a reality by the end of the 20th century, but which never came to be. What do I mean here? Here's what. The fact that Lenin and Stalin found themselves at the head of a Russia torn apart by turmoil is Russia's luck. Knowing now the personal and national scale of all their Russian political opponents, both on the right and on the left, we can confidently say that no one else but them could have led Russia away from the fate of a semi-colony of the West or from a general civilizational catastrophe in the vast Russian expanses. But the tragedy of the 20th century, which is still not understood to this day, was that Stalin turned out to be insufficiently brilliant in one respect and was unable to practically realize the most important delusion of his undoubtedly brilliant but also not far-sighted teachers in everything. That is why he made his main mistake, which I will talk about a little later. In March 1921, the 10th Congress of the RCPB adopted a resolution on the future imperialist war which stated directly, the Congress considers it necessary for the proletariat to be told that the bourgeoisie is again preparing for a grandiose attempt to deceive the workers, incite national hatred in them and to drag the peoples of America, Asia and Europe into the greatest slaughter. The forecast, as we know, was partly factually correct and in real history came true in less than 20 years. But in order to come to such conclusions, it was not necessary to master Marxist methods of analysis. 2 years before the 10th Congress, 30-year-old William Bouet wrote about the same thing, that is, that the policies of the West are programming a new world war in the future, in a letter to his former patron, US President Wilson. The Congress thought in terms of the masses. Bouet blamed Wilson specifically. The discord between bourgeois and Marxist thought is obvious, but they both agreed that war was inevitable. Under the sign of this foresight, the world lived all the years before the real war. However, if Bouet's fatalism can be forgiven, then Marxism here betrayed its own basic rule. Marxism is not a dogma, but a guide to action. And having frozen on one thesis about the inevitable upcoming massacre, Marxist thought was unable to correctly assess the unique situation that had developed by the end of the 30s in one of the largest imperialist powers, Germany. The real Stalin was, alas, no exception here. He understood the role of the masses in history very well, and the role of the individual is much worse. But that's not the problem. The trouble is that even Stalin, it seems, did not ask himself the question, could the real history of his century be built differently from the way it is built if he included a specific personality in the historical process in a new capacity? More precisely, two personalities, himself and another political leader. Perhaps the reader can already guess who the author has in mind. Stalin saw the invisible springs of real history and knew how to take them into account. However, he did not try to change the very approach to understanding how history can be built. But if at the turn of the 30s and 40s he had tried to proceed not from the postulate of the inevitable regularity of the historical process but from the characteristics of a very specific person participating in this process, then everything could have gone differently. Although this is not Stalin's fault, although he was a genius, he was a son of his era and a product of his environment. However, understanding this does not make it any less annoying. After all, it was precisely in the era of Stalin that there existed such a political leader, having influenced whom Stalin could, together with him, sharply turn the course of world history only towards creation, development and quick happiness for the entire earth. Yes, Stalin made the biggest and fatal mistake, fatal both for the future of Russia and for the future of the entire earth. He did not try to go beyond already outdated concepts in order to comprehend the role of Hitler in modern history. That is the only non-standard one, besides Stalin himself, his outstanding contemporary and a kind of partner in the formation of world political life. All the other leaders of the first decades of the 20th century, Clemenceau, Chamberlain, Wilson, Churchill, Roosevelt, could only lead the world to a war that was meaningless for humanity. They led the world to her. And they brought, and only Stalin, if he had been able to subordinate Hitler not to himself but to truly global and creative goals, would have been able, together with Hitler, to first lead the world away from a senseless war and then, through a just war, to lead the world to eternal peace. Yes, Stalin could, but he had no idea about it, and I never guessed, or maybe he guessed it but didn't have time to put the guess into action. Alas. History is measured in epochs, human life in days and years, sometimes in minutes and moments. But the closer we get to the 20th century, the more often historical and human accounts are compared. A crazy Austrian car in Italy, and there is no Napoleon's empire. The era of major European wars would have taken place without General Bonaparte, but it would still have been a different era. The personal and epochal are even more closely connected with the advent of the 20th century. The ice of the Gulf of Finland breaks under Lenin, and there is no October. An accidental fragment of a French shell into the temple of Hitler's regimental liaison, and there is no Third Reich. A well-aimed White Guard bullet at Tsaritsyn, and there is no Stalin, who will have to accept Russia as a beggar and leave it powerful. Well, the moments of the 20th and now the 21st century, indeed, sometimes fly like bullets to the temple. But only in the era of Stalin and Hitler was history ready to count, not for centuries but also not for moments. 3 years, 1939, 1940 and 1941. Had Stalin and Hitler lived them differently, had they gone to personal meetings and these years could have become not star minutes but star years of human history. Did not work out. I won't be surprised if the reader shakes his head here. They say, the author has gone too far here, he's gone too far. But let me note that now the concept of virtual reality is more than fashionable. Although the author is by no means inclined to follow fashion here. It's just that the question what would happen if is most often asked by people who are able to comprehend the possible variations of a historical era at the level of kitchen politics, and therefore answers and assumptions often smack of, if not profanation of the problem, then obvious frivolity. Although the question itself, what would happen if, is not only interesting but also correct. Despite the fashion for virtuality, most professional historians to this day consider it good form to assert that history does not tolerate the subjunctive mood. What would happen if? This, they say, is not an activity for a historian or a serious person in general. The only thing that matters is what happened, that is, the story is real. But, as already said, more and more often we are faced with the concept of virtual reality. Novels of virtual history are appearing more and more often. They also do not ignore the topic of Hitler. This is how Robert Harris wrote the bestseller Fatherland. In it, Berlin in 1964 prepares to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Führer, and 20 years ago, Hitler's army won the war. Yes, it is tempting for many to rewrite history in the spirit of what would have happened if. Just like that, it is tempting to make a thriller on this topic with Miranda Richardson and Rutger Hauer in the lead roles. It's just that there's no smell of history, even virtual history, here, because the approach itself is ahistorical. Both real and virtual Hitler, having started a war against the USSR, could only lose it. The real one, let's not forget, he lost it. The virtual story itself is, in general, a special fantasy. Not always safe, but almost always cheap. And for this reason alone, she doesn't care whether there was at least one chance of such a development of events as described by the innovators. And the heroes of this virtual story act just as mediocre and petty as the heroes of real history. But not only creators and fans of thrillers but also thoughtful scientists would do well to look at the past from an unconventional angle. The angle is not of virtuality but of rationality. Yes, in my opinion, dear reader, we can talk about three possible types of social history. The first type is a real story. The one that really happened. Alas, at almost any real moment she looks outrageously stupid and mediocre. The second type is hacky. That is the one that was called virtual history. In other words, this is history as the historical charlatan would like it to be. He, like Robert Harris, does not care about the reasons and motives that could actually arise, although they did not arise. I want to introduce the third concept of history, rational. For me, this is a story quite possible in the past when its main political leaders acted in a rational way. That is not in spite of but in accordance with their own and public interests. The real Nicholas E. brought his country to the edge of the abyss and himself and his beloved family under a bullet. But a rational Nicholas would have had a chance not only to retain the throne, even if he was now a constitutional monarch. After all, he could have survived at the same time, along with Alexei and the Grand Duchesses. The real Poland of Pilsudczyk collapsed into the hole that it dug for itself, however, with the help of France and England. And rational Poland could have kept both itself and Warsaw intact, if it had allowed USSR troops to enter its territory in the summer of 1939. And there would be no Auschwitz, but there would be gulags. The reader will object. Well, I will answer. Perhaps Poland would become part of the Union, although unlikely. And Western Belarus and Western Ukraine would probably have left Poland. That's it, the reader assents. So these are not Polish lands but ours. And the people there cried tears of happiness at the sight of Soviet tanks, not on the orders of the party organs. They simply weren't there in Lvov at that time. Of course, Banderas supporters sharpened their axes. That's why they are Banderas. Would there still be deportations? Yes. Bandera, Pilsudczyk. This is how it really happened. But a rational Poland would not have lost its 6 million citizens. The number of those repressed, not killed, even if there were any, would not have exceeded 200 to 300,000. And this way, not virtually, but rationally, you can look at much of our history. It is especially interesting and useful to develop the Hitler-Stalin problem in the genre of a novel study of rational history, first by dealing with something that happened in real history. I will say it right away. The real historical Hitler is one of my worst enemies because he is one of the worst enemies of my motherland, the USSR. However, when speaking about Hitler the creator, I mean not the real, not the virtual, but the rational German Chancellor Hitler. Hitler is, if not a friend, then a strategic partner of the Soviet Union. In my version of history there will be no red banner of victory over the Reichstag, but then there will be no burning Kiev, the ruins of Stalingrad, Dresden, Cologne. In this version, Königsberg remained Königsberg, but Sevastopol retained its Nakhimov-Grinovsky flavor. Leningrad did not take the dead to Piskarevka, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not fly up into the heavens with purple ashes. In this version there are no Panfilov heroes, but there are no torn to pieces Zaya Kosmodemyanskaya, there are no flooded mines in Donbass and no blown up Dnieper hydroelectric station. Could the story be like this, not in a thriller, but in reality? Did we have a missed but real chance for such a story? I'm sure yes. The story could have been like this. There was a chance. History really could have gone differently. The case of the real Hitler in the presence of the real Stalin was obviously doomed to failure. And here no thrillers or bestsellers can help him. Hitler's war with the USSR could not but end in failure for him and for Germany and Russia, in losses and ruins. But a strong, unbroken and developing alliance between Germany and the Union could have another, a peaceful and happy fate for the Germans and Russians. And is it only for them? Moreover, a lot was thought about options for developing relations, about rapprochement between Germany and the USSR back then. There was a possibility of rapprochement. Both friends and enemies understood this. Stalin understood. Even Hitler himself understood it even at the time of writing Mein Kampf. I'll say a little about this later. However, they often thought correctly, but in both countries they acted incorrectly every now and then, contrary to reasonable, rational historical logic. Perhaps what played a cruel joke on Russia was that Stalin and Russia did not learn to push ideology into second place when it interfered with the external interests of the socialist motherland. We got rid of Trotskyism, but as life has shown, more slowly than we should have. At first look, this approach of mine may seem adventurous at best, and blasphemous at worst, but I reject such accusations. I thought a lot before taking up the pen and asked myself, am I falling into profanation? Doesn't even the mental assumption of a tour of the Führer of the German people around the Moscow Kremlin next to Stalin and Molotov insult the memory of those who actually fell? I thought about this a lot, reader, and finally decided no. After all, in the book, the Tsar Bell and the Tsar Cannon are not the same Hitler who signed the Barbarossa Plan and the directives on the scorched Russian land tactics, not the one who proclaimed the rejection of the chimera of conscience in the war on the East Front. Within the framework of my view of the past, there is a Hitler who abandoned the idea of Drang nach Außen, and there is no Hitler who, starting from June 22, 1941, was rightly perceived by any Russian and Soviet person as a hellish degenerate. On the contrary, I mean such a rational chancellor of the Third Reich, who with his Eastern policy ensured the mighty Great Germany, but at the same time also the implementation of the rational Third, Fourth, Fifth Five-Year plans in the USSR. That is, it ensured the undisturbed peaceful development of the Great Soviet Union in one of the two decisive periods of the world historical process. What about the memory of the fallen? Well, if history had taken a rational path, then there would have been no casualties. However, that's not all. Let's ask ourselves directly. Isn't the former Stalinist falcon with 2 gold stars on his chest, huddling like a hungry little dog at the feet of his homegrown Russian friends, all sorts of Billies and Brans, really insulting the memory of his fallen frontline friends? And don't the current Russian history courses, which are not far removed from the Robert Harris thriller, insult the memory of the fallen and at the same time desecrate the young memory of those who are just mastering this world? The Germans are now erecting monuments to their fallen with the boastful inscription, "To those defeated by the invincible." Who is to blame for this if not the descendants of those who were greeted as victors in 1945 on that very land that has now been devastated by renegades for 10 years, worse than the real Hitler? And what inscriptions do we have the right to make on the monuments to our fallen? To those who have won from those who betrayed them? No, it is also necessary to consider the rational, unfulfilled version of the past history of the motherland in order for it to have a future rational history. And this is not blasphemy, but a search for optimal paths to the future continuation of the old 1000-year history. Stories where the feet of those who actually fell will not only not be slandered, but will also be justified by the deeds of their descendants. In the meantime, before us, my dear reader, are the main figures of our narrative and the time when they gained strength and power. Hitler and Stalin, Russia and Germany, and the eventful 20s in which the no less stormy 30s began. Chapter 2. Stalin, Hitler and their commentators. A lot of truth and even more stupid, deceitful nonsense has been said about Hitler and Stalin. Moreover, the Anglo-Saxons did their best with regard to Hitler and the current new Russian hacks with regard to Stalin. However, here they also followed in the footsteps of the Anglo-Saxons. For example, a certain Shima Skorbevich Shevotsukov in a publication recommended as a textbook for history teachers including university ones writes, in a short biography of Stalin, published in 1950, it was said, the direct inspirer and organizer of the most important victories of the Red Army was Stalin. He was the creator of the most important strategic plans. The most glorious victories of our Red Army are associated with the name of Stalin. All this can only bring a smile to the modern reader. However, a smile, both angry and sorrowful, can only be caused by the impudence of such carefree Skorbevichs. Firstly, in 1950 the people themselves associated their most glorious victories with the name of Stalin. Secondly, the better we learn the true history of the war, the larger the military genius of Stalin emerges, the greatest commander of all times and all peoples, simply because he led the largest war in world history, and under his leadership this war was victoriously completed. Everyone who collaborated with Stalin as the supreme commander-in-chief admits that Stalin very quickly and efficiently mastered the science of military leadership, although before the war he left purely military issues to military military professionals and began to delve into them only after the misfires of the Red Army in the Finnish War. But even during the Civil War, Stalin's role was exceptional. From May 1918, that is, from the very beginning of the Civil War, he was appointed head of food affairs in the south of Russia with dictatorial powers, and on June 6 departed for Tsaritsyn with a special detachment of 400 people. The key moment of the first military summer was the defense of Tsaritsyn. The Reds called it Red Warden, and the Whites, in general, agreed with this definition. On this score, it is enough to Red Wrangle. The surrender of Tsaritsyn to the Civil War was similar to the surrender of Stalingrad, that is, the same Tsaritsyn, to the Great Patriotic War, and Tsaritsyn is Stalin's first major success in the emerging Stalinist era. In September 1918, the Southern Front was created, and Stalin was actively fighting against Trotsky, who wanted to saturate his leadership with his protégés. As a result, we had a number of failures, and things got better only after Stalin reappeared in the South as a member of the Military Council of the Southern Front. And before that, Stalin eliminates the catastrophic failures on the Eastern Front. In the spring of 1919, with the mandate of the authorized Central Committee, he arrived in Zinoviyev's Petrograd, organized the defense of the city from the advancing Yadenich. Actually, during the Civil War, Stalin was doing what his specially authorized representatives of the headquarters of the Supreme High Command were doing later during the Great Patriotic War. Perhaps the very institution of representatives of the headquarters arose as a rethinking of Stalin's personal military experience during the Civil War. Everyone with the slightest interest in history has heard the ringing about the conflict between Stalin and Tukhachevsky during the Polish War. They say that Stalin, an envious and military ignorant, thwarted the brilliant strategic plans of the clever Tukhachevsky, did not give the latter time to the 1st Cavalry, etc. This story was well analyzed by such an original analyst as Yuri Ignatievich Makin. And without dwelling on it in detail here, I'll just say that Stalin's correctness in the strategic assessment of the situation on the Polish front and the wrongness of the Central Committee were later recognized by Lenin himself. But this is not the story as presented by the Shevotsukovs, but they extol Trotsky and his trusted favorite Efrem Skliansky. Hitler in the USSR was traditionally portrayed as an ordinary neurasthenic or fiend of hell, but he was not given much attention personally. His figure never became the subject of scientific or journalistic research in our country. Almost the only exception here is the book by Daniil Melnikov and Lyudmila Chernaya, Criminal Number 1. And the title already speaks of the dishonesty of the authors. Yes, the real results of the policies of the real Hitler turned out to be, of course, criminal. But if we even take his own era, that is, the first half of the 20th century, then priority among the world's political criminals should be given not to Hitler and his associates, but to the Anglo-Saxon behind-the-scenes organizers and warmongers. In addition, the essence of Hitler's crime was most often distorted and is being distorted in a way that benefits the main criminals and their followers in the West or primitive capitalist ideologists. At the same time, none of them is naturally inclined to ask the question, why did Hitler's Germany and he himself take the path that led them to collapse? In other words, was the Nazi Reich criminal by its very essence, or did it have a certain healthy basis and only at some point strayed onto a truly criminal path? Neither Soviet nor Western historians have ever given a complete answer to this question, simply because they have never posed it in its entirety. However, Soviet works about the era of Hitler are valuable because they complement Western sources well, and the works of the democratic West are interesting insofar as they tell us data and facts that were suppressed or pushed into the background by the agitprop of the PSU Central Committee. The Western range of images of Hitler is wider than the Soviet one. He ranges from assessments of the Führer as a genius and an occult messiah to the same monster who supposedly imposed his will on everyone. As if the steel magnates and iron old Prussian generals were middle-aged kindergarteners or impressionable college girls. And Stalin. Today his appearance is also falsified to the utmost and is presented along the same spectral lines. from genius to gloomy tyrant. Although the real Stalin rose above any usual assessments to a greater extent than any other politician of our time, Stalin, of course, met all the requirements of a political genius, starting with an extraordinary memory and the ability to quickly and accurately enter into issues that were new to him. A competent social reformer must also be a kind of all-rounder. And then Stalin turned out to be strong like no one before him, with the exception of Lenin. True, he had almost no one to compete with in this category, because outstanding reformers driven exclusively by the interests of the working majority are almost unknown to history. Marx, Engels, Lenin, maybe Mahatma Gandhi, and Stalin. It's interesting how Alexander Lvovna Tolstoy described him. The daughter of the great Russian writer left Soviet Russia in 1929. According to the documents, she temporarily went to Japan with a series of lectures, and due to her spiritual inclinations, she left her homeland forever, taking with her also temporarily a collectible guitar made by Khrushchev from 1828. Tolstoy was spiteful towards the new Russia. In this sense, we can talk about Alexander Tolstoy as a mirror of the Russian intelligentsia. Standing in the middle of her Yasnaya Polyana, she did not see, and stupidly did not want to see, the young growth of the new Soviet forest behind the fallen old trees. She was even more loyal to Tsarism, declaring that it was then that her father's books were published for the common people in millions of copies. And precisely because of her anti-Sovietism, what she wrote about her only meeting with Stalin is valuable for its psychological authenticity. And she wrote this: in appearance, Stalin reminded me of a non-commissioned officer from the former guards or a gendarmerie officer. A thick mustache, as only military men of this type wore, regular facial features, a narrow forehead, a stubborn, energetic chin, a powerful build, and a completely non-Bolshevik courtesy. When I left, he stood up again and walked me to the door. In this sketch one can see a purposeful, collected person, but not at all demonic. And the life of a professional revolutionary did not contribute to the development of stormy and dark passions. Hitler's personality also, of course, extraordinary, was formed in the living conditions of not even bohemians but semi-lumpen people. As a result, he turned out to be a strong-willed man, a man of strong inner ideas but without a strong moral core. Stalin was a mighty rock against which any storm would break. Hitler is a stormy river that can create and destroy, but the course of which is determined not so much by itself as by circumstances. In any case, whatever one may say, one cannot be taken away from both. The self-taught Hitler in the 20th century, in a stably hierarchical bourgeois country with developed social structures, rose from corporal to Führer. And quite with a rational development of events, he could have become not a criminal, but German. No. 1. Self-taught, Stalin accepted Russia as a vast Russia, but left it as a nuclear one. And with this he already reserved his rightful place among such most outstanding people of Russia as Lenin and Peter. Surprisingly, even voluminous studies devoted to Stalin and Hitler, these major figures in the world historical process, are riddled with misunderstanding. Well, the distortion of the meaning of Stalin's personality came into fashion with the difficult hand of Leon Trotsky. At first it was popular in the West, and now here too. But Hitler wasn't much luckier here either. Let's say the German Joachim Fest wrote a 1000-page biography of Hitler, and there is a lot of interesting things in it. However, the truest and most profound thing there is a couple of phrases from the introductory preliminary reflection. Here they are. If Hitler had been the victim of an assassination attempt at the end of 1938, few would have doubted that he should be called one of the greatest statesmen among the Germans, perhaps even the end of their history. His aggressive speeches and his plans for world domination would probably have sunk into oblivion as a creation of the imagination of his early years and would only have been remembered occasionally, to the indignation of the nation, by its critics. Alas, Fest's very next phrase fails. Why? Probably because he, like many others, did not escape the blindness of sluggish anti-communism. That's why he points his finger at the sky, declaring, 6.5 years separated Hitler from this glory. Well, let's do the math. 6.5 years starting from the end of 1938. This is exactly the spring of 1945, in which the smoke of the funeral pyre of the real Hitler and Eva Braun mixed with the smoke of the burning Reichstag and the fumes from the shots of heavy Soviet Joseph Stalin tanks. To smashing this Reichstag, as we see, Fest is rather weak in arithmetic. 6.5 years separated Hitler not from glory, but from death and infamy. But could there have been another path for him to glory and well-deserved national deification? Yes, but Fest could not even mentally imagine this completely possible path. His imagination was only enough to declare, of course, only a violent end could help him, that is, Hitler. SK. In this, that is, in acquiring impeccable greatness. SK. So, according to Fest, it turns out that Hitler was unlucky to become the victim of a successful assassination attempt in time. That is, he should have, for example, stayed a little longer in November 1939 at the Munich beer hall Biergerber Keller for the next anniversary of the beer hall putsch. Another half hour, and only a bloody brown shirt could have remained from Hitler, and the assassination attempt on the carpenter Elsner would have turned out to be completely successful from an almost successful one. And the Führer, in accordance with Fest's concept, would remain in the eyes of the nation a hero higher than Bismarck. Well, no, dear reader, it's not that simple. Yes, Elsner could have been luckier. He could have prepared his explosion a year earlier. But with the death of Hitler, the entire Reich of that time would simply fall into shock, which would be replaced by chaos and civil unrest. The collective generals' conspiracies that were being prepared in 1938 could not have had a different result. No, with a violent end, all of Hitler's positive efforts, and they were, as will be discussed later, would have gone to waste. But he himself would not have gained immortal laurels. Fest could not imagine the only true path that would make Hitler truly the greatest German in history, for the reason that the absence of genuine historicism is the flip side of anti-communism. But what kind of path is this? I will answer right away. The path of honest cooperation with the Soviet Union in the interests of two peoples, German and Soviet. At the end of 1938, Hitler was separated from the possible glory of completing the history of the Germans not by 6 years but by 2 years. He was obliged to destroy and destroyed the system of the Treaty of Versailles. He had the right to demand and demanded the Sudetenland, the Polish Corridor and Danzig. He could and did start a European war. And in all these actions he was morally and historically sound. He could even, looking after the interests of the Germans and without much violence to the logic of history, enter the Czech Republic. But the war with the USSR did not meet the interests of either Germany or Hitler. And if not for a number of other people's provocations and Hitler's and Stalin's own miscalculations, the miscalculations of the peoples of Germany and the USSR, then such a war, that is a war between Russians and Germans, might not have happened. I will repeat again and again. There was a real basis for this turn of events, and on this basis an unfulfilled rational history could take place if two outstanding figures of two outstanding nations could look into each other's eyes. And so that you, my reader, can better imagine the main characters of this novel research, let's take a closer look at them and some of their commentators. Interest in Hitler and Stalin, with rare exceptions, unhealthy, is still great today. Proof of this is the still unabated popularity of anti-Stalin insinuations not only in Russia but also abroad, although the popularity of Generalissimo by Vladimir Karpov is also obvious. There has always been an abundance of literature about Hitler in the West, and after 1991 there was a proliferation of literature in Russia, mostly translated. Despite this, to this day there is not a single honest and comprehensive biography of Hitler in the world. Almost the same can be said about Stalin. Two books, for example, Defending Stalin by Vladimir Zakry and Alexei Golenkov, fill the gap poorly. Yuri Emelianov's Stalinist 2-volume book does not clarify the matter much either. Yuri Makin and, oddly enough, such a specific researcher as Viktor Suvorov wrote well about Stalin. Despite signs of at least social schizophrenia, Rizan is sometimes strikingly accurate in his assessments of the era and its heroes. The sensational two-volume work The Generalissimo is quite objective but not very deep. The most accurate are the small works about Stalin written by Richard Koselopov, obviously the most important social thinker of the late 20th century and the beginning of this century. With all this, the mass image of Stalin in Russia is still not even close to the truth. What can we say about the West? They stubbornly refuse to admit that the real Stalin in foreign policy made a decisive personal contribution to stopping the very significant attempts of the real Hitler to create a world Reich, but in domestic politics for decades he did not have a single constructive alternative. Churchill's exact phrase that Stalin received Russia with a plow and left it with an atomic bomb does little to improve the situation, as does Churchill's admission that upon entering Stalin's hall he wanted to stand up and stretch out his arms at his sides. But the West at least recognized the magnitude of Stalin's figure. In the USSR, Hitler was completely denied on a large political and human scale. None of the historians of the KSU Central Committee even tried to ask the question. What allowed a former corporal from the lower ranks in the 20th century, in the center of Europe, to become the undisputed leader of a country that was previously under the rule of the aristocratic and industrial elite? If this question arose, the answer was known in advance: a protege. Is it so? After all, Hitler is a unique example in world history. The second outstanding figure from the very bottom, Stalin grew into the leader of the country in the conditions of a proletarian state where the principle "who was nothing will become everything" was written on the official banners. In Germany, before Hitler, the classic bourgeois principle said, "everyone to his own." And it was not so easy to gain supreme power under the conditions of his action. For a commoner it is almost impossible. But Hitler was a commoner. How did he rise if he did not have some outstanding qualities? His rise assumed such qualities automatically, didn't it? But no, we saw in Hitler only a petty villain, called to power by the capitalist and military elite of the West to strangle communism in Germany, in Europe, and then in the USSR. Oh, if only it were really that simple. A most curious figure, Freud's collaborator and theorist of the sexual revolution, the German Willy Reich, did not come to court either in the Reich or in the United States, where he moved in 1939. He was also interested in Marxism, was a member of the German Communist Party for 6 years, and therefore knew what he was writing when he criticized pseudo-Marxism in his Fascism and Psychology of the Masses. Reading Reich's book is not easy. It is written vividly, but deals with very serious issues. However, it is useful to bring something on our topic from there. So, Marxism, like many achievements of great thinkers, turned into empty formulas and in the hands of Marxist politicians lost its scientific and revolutionary effectiveness. Degenerating, scientific Marxism turned into vulgar Marxism. First of all, we must free ourselves from the concepts of vulgar Marxism, which only block the path to understanding fascism. Vulgar Marxism completely separates economics from social life as a whole and asserts that the ideology and consciousness of a person are determined exclusively and directly by his economic life. Vulgar Marxists try their best to ignore the structure and dynamics of ideology. They dismiss it as psychology, which cannot be Marxist, and leave the subjective, that is, personal, human, factor, the so-called mental life in history, to the discretion of political reaction and the Rosenbergs, I mean the Nazi theorist, who, oddly enough, achieve enormous success thanks to this thesis. The neglect of this aspect in sociology was criticized by Marx himself. The more energetically vulgar Marxists deny psychology, the more often they resort in practice to lifeless hypocrisy. For example, they try to explain the historical situation as Hitler's psychosis to console the masses and convince them not to lose faith in Marxism. The fact that political reaction invariably finds a way out of a difficult situation, and that an acute economic crisis can lead to both barbarism and social freedom, remains a sealed book for vulgar Marxists. Well said. Of course, there is no doubt. Hartfield's famous cartoon photomontage "Millions Are Behind Me" since 1932, where a fat huge capitalist puts a wad of banknotes behind his back into the hand of little Hitler thrown back in a Nazi salute, is a brilliant and accurate image. But the second side of the matter was that behind Hitler there were other millions and tens of millions of Germans. Not only the militarists Hindenburg, Fritsch and Blomberg, the aristocrats von Papen and von Brauchitsch, not only the industrialists from the circle of friends of the Reichsführer SS Himmler, veterans of the First World War, soldiers and ordinary officers of the Reichswehr, women, workers and peasants, youth, students also went for Hitler. And they walked with their eyes burning, whatever one may say, not with psychosis but with hope. They went because Hitler expressed their thoughts better than others, even better than the German communists and Th. Man, struck by the same vulgar Marxism that Reich wrote so well about. Did the real Stalin understand this? Marxism is not vulgar but classical, modeled on Marx Engels. Although it recognized the importance of the human factor and the importance of the psychological moment in history, it still did not put it on a par with the economic factor. The main criterion for Marxism remained the economy, production relations and the class structure of society. If Hitler fit into a purely Marxist framework, it was only as a truly agent of the propertied class because he himself was poor. Therefore, Stalin for a long time considered Italian fascism and German Nazism. In our country it was incorrectly called German fascism, only as a typical, extreme form of the reaction of capital to the strengthening of the revolutionary activity of labor. Alas, upon closer examination, Hitler clearly did not fit into a purely class framework. He was visibly, fundamentally more independent than the traditional parliamentary political leaders of the West after he became the head of the country. Was the real Stalin capable of seeing this essence of his opponent and drawing the right conclusions for us? Well, at least he was able to understand it. Capable because, unlike Trotsky, Bukharin, Radek and all the Lumins and Rutens there, he was a man from the same dough from which fate molded Marx, Engels, Lenin, three thinkers for whom intellectual and behavioral posture were simply unthinkable. They and Stalin. There was a moment when they were depicted like this, a collective portrait one after another, and this outwardly official symbol reflected the real essence quite well. Despite the mistakes and delusions, these four, more than anyone else in the entire history of people, were dominated not by prejudices or base passions, but by an accurate vision of history and the society that they transformed with their thoughts or business. If the real, historical Stalin still psychologically blundered in the situation with Hitler and did not try to turn it around for the benefit of Germany and Russia, then the point, perhaps, is not in some Stalinist limitations but in the unprecedented enormity of the task. It is unlikely that in those days anyone could have dealt with it except Stalin himself. What's there to cope with? Simply installing it was an almost impossible task. Neither Hitler nor Stalin were tyrants. Although to varying degrees, they were not devoid of spiritual breadth and generosity. If it were otherwise, then their immediate everyday environment, security, secretaries, technical staff would not like them. But they were loved. They were not in awe, but were simply spiritually disposed in response to their spiritual disposition. What about the state and political environment? After all, these were people of high rank themselves, people of extraordinary abilities. However, they also sincerely respected the Russians, the General Secretary of the Bolshevik Party Stalin, the Germans, the Reich Chancellor of Germany Hitler. They respected them because they saw them as individuals superior to them or not inferior to them. You will not find, that is, you will not find at all, memoirs of those who collaborated with Stalin for a long time in a business-like manner and often suffered a lot from him and who would not speak of him with the deepest respect, even criticizing him. Of course, we are not talking about the Trotskys here, but about people of concrete, practical work, industrial organizers, designers, military leaders, metallurgists, power engineers. One of the little-known memoirists, former People's Commissar of Power Plants Dmitry Zhaymarin, graduated from the Moscow Energy Institute in 1931. The peasant son mastered science well and was enrolled in graduate school. But soon I had to get involved in practical energy and over time enter that circle that can be called Stalin's big team to become Stalin's People's Commissar. Their first meeting was not the most successful. Due to the overload of the Ural factories, a power supply crisis occurred there and Zhaimarin was summoned to the Kremlin. They are complaining about you that factories are shutting down in the Urals. There is a drop. They suggested frequency from the outside. Yes, the frequency is dropping. What is this, by the way? Stalin asked him. Reader. Only an absolutely natural person, devoid of posture and self-importance, can ask this. Zhaimarin is almost a boy. Stalin is a recognized leader. And the leader, not afraid to seem ignorant to the boy, asks, what kind of animal is this frequency? Zhaimarin explained, and Stalin asked a second question. What do you suggest? Zhaimarin proposed a solution, and Stalin immediately grasped the essence. The first impression did not deceive the young people's commissar. Over many years of subsequent communication, both in personal meetings and at Politburo meetings, Stalin was just as attentive and patient as at the first meeting. He objected to Zhaimarin once in a dispute over the construction of the Kremenchug hydroelectric station. He got up from the table, walked over and asked, are you going to argue with me for a long time? This is the first. And second, why don't you build small hydroelectric power stations on the tributaries of the Dnieper? The banks are low-lying, it is impossible to build stations there, Comrade Stalin. Were you there? Was not. And I fought there. Go, have a look, and then argue. Hitler, of course, was inferior to Stalin in the ability to penetrate into the essence of a specific technical problem. True, here none of the government leaders of that time in any country in the world could compete with Stalin. However, in this regard, Hitler, having no technical education, was by no means a layman. Next, I will give an interesting testimony on this score from Tank General Melanchthon. As for the rest, the Führer's intellect was quite enough to ensure the business-like respect of his senior circle. Some later argued the opposite in their memoirs, such as Halder and other generals. But that was later, when the Reich was in ruins and Hitler was accused and belittled in order to whitewash himself. In Halder, this post-war approach manifested itself quite clearly, but is it worth much? In his pre-war official diary, Halder does not detect any latent dissatisfaction with Hitler. And don't let the words office diary confuse us, reader. Halder conducted it, transcribing the information using an old, non-standard cursive system, so that it was, in fact, almost a cipher. If Halder had been disloyal, this would have come out involuntarily. That is, the post-war Halder can be trusted with great caution. With caution, especially since even with the catastrophic outcome of the real World War I for Germany, not all of the Führer's former comrades raised their hand to give him denigrating characteristics. And here any positive testimony can be completely trusted, because flattery cannot explain anything. This is what Colonel General Alfred Jodl, the former Chief of Staff of the Operational Command and Control of Troops at the headquarters of the Supreme Command of the German Armed Forces, said about the Führer on June 17, 1945 when he was interrogated by Soviet security officers. Only history can characterize Hitler's personality. Of course, he is a genius, an extraordinary person, innately adapted to work, an eternal worker. He surprised everyone with his memory, which was phenomenal. He read extremely widely and was competent in all areas. In his personal life he lived as he preached, modestly and simply. As a leader and military leader, he made decisions extremely quickly. However, where there is a lot of light, there is a lot of shadow. An even better litmus test is children. Neither Stalin nor Hitler were sentimental, and their obvious weakness for children, who responded to them with complete reciprocity, cannot be explained by a penchant for crocodile tears. Yes, Hitler was not equal to Stalin in firmness and spiritual fortitude, so it was not in vain that Stalin chose the appropriate pseudonym. It was his people's commissars who were iron, but he himself was made of steel. But not with children. Both with our own and with strangers. Yes, and with his own, although his relationship with his sons was difficult, especially with Vasily and Hitler. Taking in your hands any photograph of Hitler or Stalin with children, you involuntarily succumb to its charm. Looking at Hitler, bending over to Goebbels' two charming 5-year-old daughters, Helga and Hild, you think only one thing. And this cannot be attributed to the admiration of children inspired by adults. For these girls, and named after Hitler with an H, the first letter of the surname Hitler, the Führer was simply a kind grandfather. And children sense falsehood perhaps a little worse than dogs. Dogs, however, also loved Hitler. But Stalin's letter to his daughter. I quote it from a photocopy placed in the book Stalin's Chief Bodyguard by Alexander Kolesnik, which consists not of gossip but of fragments of the court case of General Vlasic. Stalin's handwriting, despite his bright personality, is so legible that without any effort you read, "Hello to my hostess Setanka. I received all your letters. Thanks for the letters. I didn't answer letters because I was very busy. How are you spending your time? How is your English? Are you feeling well? I am healthy and cheerful as always. It's a bit boring without you, but what can you do? I endure it. I kiss you deeply. Your secretary folder Stalin. I kiss my mistress." 22v. 39. And if we have already picked up Kolesnik's small but important and useful book, then let's take a closer look at Ivy's detective card placed there. Jyagashvili from the archives of the Trust Secret Police. Photo in profile, full face, standing, where in small typographical letters it is typed, height 1 meter, and then before the typographical sant, 74 is handwritten. So, the height is average. And how many times have you read and heard about the dwarf Stalin? Well, yes. Snow White next to a dwarf with a height of 1 meter 74 would not seem large. In the same way, one often reads about Hitler's plainness, although studying photographs convinces us otherwise. Not homely, but unusual. It was easy to draw caricatures of Hitler, indeed, in many, but not all photographs he is slightly caricatured. However, it rather stands out among others so that the eye immediately catches it. Not homeliness, but an unusually expressed individuality is visible in his appearance. By the way, women liked him even when he was not the leader of the nation. And when surrounded by the military or in the party environment, he acquires the features of smartness, which is sometimes not devoid of true greatness. Here he is going down the wide stairs in Nuremberg, buttoning his raincoat, flying in the wind at his throat, unprepossessing. Well, someone who says this only proves their psychological and emotional ignorance and bias. Hitler, like Stalin, was extremely personal. True, in a different manner than Stalin. Hitler can be seen as the ultimate expression, the pole of political individualism. Stalin is the pole of such political collectivism. When the whole country is included in the collective, a magnet has two poles that cannot exist at one point. However, powerful lines of force are created at the distance between them. Stalin had to act quickly, without thinking, because life did not give him time to think. The count went on for years. In 10 years it was necessary to create a country with European economic parameters or perish under the pressure of either the Anglo-French or the Germans. And the danger was not only external. Trotskyism was also not just a reality, but a deadly reality, both for Stalin and for the country. The best commentators on events, personalities and ideas are impartial commentators. Unfortunately, impartiality is hardly possible in politics. However, the positive opinions of ill-wishers are no less valuable. You have to believe them willy-nilly. Therefore, for a commentary on the Stalin-Trotsky problem, we turn, reader, to academician Vladimir Vernadsky. Here you can trust him almost absolutely. Vernadsky gave his assessment of Stalin in his personal diary, which was not intended for prying eyes. During the days of the trials of the Trotskyists, it was noted there, the policy of Stalin-Molotov is Russian and is needed for the state. Their party enemies are also enemies of the Russian people. The academician, although he was a member of the USSR Academy of Sciences, did not like either Stalin or communism. The diary was kept solely for the soul, and not for the curator of the NKVD. But he loved Russia. and therefore he understood that only Stalin could lead it forward, and it was the Trotskyists who could destroy it and hand it over to the West. But, say, in the intelligence directorate of the Red Army, even in the mid-30s, they formed almost the backbone. There were also plenty of them in the related department, the NKVD intelligence. Someone was identified right in Moscow. Someone escaped, but he was removed in time, like Ignatius Rice. Some, like Walter Krivitsky, managed to escape. Before this Trotsky follower was caught up in New York, he spilled a lot to the intelligence service and the FBI. It was Krivitsky who almost betrayed our outstanding intelligence officer Kim Philby in 1937. And I didn't pass only because I didn't know everything. NKVD resident in Spain Nikolsky Orlov stole £30,000 from the station's cash register, at that time 10 to 15 years of quiet life, but dodged the KGB bullet due to the guarantees of his silence given to his former colleagues. He fulfilled the guarantees and saved his life. These far from exhaustive examples alone are enough to understand how difficult the situation in the USSR was with internal Trotskyism, how deeply and highly it was personified. The same Orlov had the rank of general. Krivitsky headed the Western European Intelligence Department. These were combat footage of the World Revolution. But there was no certainty that these were the cadres of the land of Soviets, the cadres of Stalin. Later, life itself proved that Stalin's doubts and, accordingly, repressions towards this layer were reasonable. Here is Leopold Trepper, the famous big chief of the Red Chapel of the Red Army Intelligence Department. He was not repressed in 1937. He worked for the intelligence agency throughout the war in Belgium and France, was arrested by the Gestapo, survived and remained a convinced Trotskyist for the rest of his life. True, he admitted his devotion to Trotsky and Zionism to boot in print in 1975. By that time, Stalin had been lying in the ground for many years, and Hitler, and his political fate was not a quiet one. For the time being, Stalin had to tolerate the Trotskyists even in the leadership circle close to him. But Hitler also had to put up with, and also for the time being, with many. Captain Rem and other bosses of the assault troops were homosexuals. Hitler treated non-traditionally sexually oriented men with disgust. Later in the SS, the sin of sodomy was punishable by death on his instructions. But these non-traditional ones were a dime a dozen in Weimar Germany. But behind Rem there were influential forces and circles with strong potency, not only in sexual terms. Rem was also a good organizer, which is why he believed that he was quite an equal to Hitler and could become the Führer himself. The time has come, and the Rems had to be removed. They were already interfering not only with Hitler, but also with Germany. So Hitler also had enough of his Trotskys, always ready to grab the steering wheel, but only believing that they were capable of steering. Stalin is hated in the West. Hitler is not liked. In 1997, the New York Times ranked the 100 most outstanding military leaders of all eras. Adolf Hitler is number 14 there. Peter the Great is in the second 10. There are, in the back, Ivan Konev and Georgy Zhukov, but for the one who controlled the world's greatest war for 5 years, who defeated the real Hitler and led Konev and Zhukov, there was no place in this rating at all. Why? But precisely because, I repeat, the convinced, outstanding Bolshevik Stalin is the number one military leader of all times and peoples. No one else in real history has even come close to organizing the gigantic military efforts of a huge power and its troops, interacting with allies, making strategic decisions under conditions of constant time pressure in a rapidly changing environment, at the same time not losing control of the political and economic leadership of a great country and thinking about her future. Even Lenin had more modest tasks, and let alone Napoleon. However, not only Napoleon was included in the rating, but even his Marshal Marmont. Although Marmont on the scale of modern warfare would hang somewhere between the levels of Corps Commander and Army Commander. Stalin had more than a dozen fronts alone, and the number of armies exceeded 50. Only one man, his opponent Hitler, was forced to solve problems of equal scale and nature, but he ultimately did not solve them. But Stalin decided. Actually, Stalin did not solve these problems in the best way, but anyone else in his place would have simply failed. Churchill did not get out of bed until noon. He drank tea, read letters, received clerks and ministers. Reader, think. He didn't even work in a robe, but in bed. Yes, if Stalin's problems suddenly fell on Churchill overnight, then as if some kind of sin would not have happened to him in his working bed. To talk a lot about such biographers of Stalin as Volkaganov and others like him means not to respect oneself. If their books certify anyone, it is only themselves. This is a social, more precisely antisocial order in its pure, more precisely, however, dirty form. It's more difficult with books like The Rise and Fall of Stalin by Fyodor Volkov. In the 1970s and 1980s, several of his works on modern history were published, written in a typical Soviet agitprop manner. However, his book about Stalin, signed for publication on March 18, 1992, is already thickly saturated with the fumes of perestroika. And its reviewer, by the way, is academician Samsonov, the same one who for decades praised the wisdom and leadership role of his native Communist Party, only with a slightly less sweet voice than the Psu General Volkaganov. However, despite the antagonism of their surnames, both Volkov and Volkaganov ended up in the same pack, the falsifier. Back in 1989, Doctor of Historical Sciences Volkov, together with another doctor, Arutyunov, reported that they were familiar with a document confirming Stalin's collaboration with the Tsarist secret police, and the original, they say, is stored in the Central State Archive of the October Revolution in the fund of the Police Department of the Yenisei Provincial Gendarmerie Department. But such a fund has never existed. These same doctors also cite another deliberate security fake, although there were more than one or two fakes before. Particularly well known is the so-called letter of the gendarme Colonel Eremin, put into circulation by the American Levin and worked very clumsily, starting from the shape of the corner stamp and its spelling, continuing with text errors and ending with the obvious forgery of Eremin's signature, well known to archivists from original documents of the police department. This is the case with one of the most professionally close to the historical sphere of slanderers of Stalin. Volkov's Stalin is absolutely black, because this is a look through black glasses. But through glasses and not a black bandage, because Volkov wants to remain within the framework of historical research and not libel. And his book contains not only anger but also facts and figures from the life of the USSR during the Stalin era. It was they who led Volkov down. Upon thoughtful reading, the result turns out to be the opposite of the author's intention. What appears before us is not an evil figure, but a great figure in the difficult struggle for the power and greatness of the country. However, what do we need homegrown analysts when there is a comparative biography of Stalin and Hitler written in our days, written by the famous English historian Sir Alan Bullock, Hitler and Stalin, Life and Power. The book is well known, published and reprinted in different countries of the world. 2 volumes can contain a lot, and Sir Alan contains a lot in them. But what? It would seem that such a book, if it is the work of a historian written for the general public, simply must be not only popular but also historical, that is, accurate in facts and accurate in concepts. Alas, it has more to do with the market of quasi-historical literature, but not with history. The case of Sir Alan is very fresh and revealing. So let's dwell on it a little, reader. Well, is it possible to take seriously a historian who refers to numerical estimates regarding the repressed made by the physicist Sakharov, the greatest, as confirmed by all my weapons colleagues, theoretical physicists, specialist in his field? Sakharov understood history and politics. Here I can give an assessment myself, a little better than paleontology. To be convinced of this, it is enough to get acquainted with the printed research of his political thought. But that's just the little things. To understand the level of historicity and solidness of Sir Alan, it is enough to open at random almost any of the pages of his Stalin-Hitler epic and compare the statements there, not with historical thrillers but with historical data. For example, Bullock can write like this: although slave labor in the camps was not very productive, it was still part of the Soviet economy. Millions worked in the mines, 1.5 million at construction sites, laying railroad tracks. This was not written by a science fiction writer or a tabloid scribbler. This was written by a historian. He may not give numbers, but he must know them. Only by knowing them can he build his story. So, according to Bullock, in the Stalinist USSR there were millions of slave miners alone. Well, let's check the numbers. In 1913, there were 643,745 mining and mining workers in Russia. This is all, not only in the mines. The number of cutting machines did not reach hundreds, and the share of mechanized coal mining did not reach 2%, 1.7%. At that time, 29,117,000 tons of coal were mined almost manually. By the time described by Bullock, coal production in the USSR had increased to 64 million tons in 1932 and 128 million in 1937. However, there were 1,278 heavy cutting machines alone. There were almost 7,000 jackhammers, and mechanized coal mining reached 89.6% by 1937, in Germany 84.7%, in the USA 77%, in Sir Alan's England 51%. True, more than half of the mined coal was rolled by hand, so the number of miners in the country has not decreased that much compared to 1913. But there was no smell of the millions somewhere found by Bullock, and only slave prisoners. And about Hitler, the leader of English historians can write that by 1934 he had come to terms with the fact that the economic revival and rearmament of Germany is impossible without cooperation with the elite of the traditional classes of society. Officers, bureaucrats and entrepreneurs. Knowing how closely Hitler was connected with the elite already at the turn of the 20s and 30s, otherwise he would not have risen with all his talents as a politician, and knowing that this has not been a secret for a long time, one can only laugh at Sir Alan to his heart's content. Further, reader, we will see more than once that Hitler not only collaborated but actively attracted the elite to his side from the very beginning of serious political activity. Already during the unsuccessful putsch of 1923, the Führer walked arm in arm with General Ludendorff, and by the early 1930s his alliance with the industrial and service elite, with von Papen and von Blomberg, with the industrialists Kerdorff and Thyssen, was not just an established fact but a decisive fact. Sir Alan, following, presumably, Plutarch, used the experience of comparative biography. And that's why he sometimes combines both of his heroes in one phrase. For example, like this: if Stalin saw the fist as the main obstacle to the implementation of the agricultural modernization program, then Hitler proclaimed the peasantry the ever-living foundation of the German nation. Well, the kulak and the individual farmer in the USSR really became the main obstacles to agriculture by the end of the 1920s. I am not Sir Alan, and to show this I will turn to numbers. According to the most authoritative expert Nikolai Kondratiev, in 1913 Russia had a surplus of grain of 656,022,000 poods, more than 10 million tons. This is all bread, food, feed and secondary. Exports were correspondingly high. But the same Kondratiev reveals the secret of such abundance: low, insufficient domestic consumption. The average resident of the Russian Empire was content with a norm that was 2.5 pounds less than a Frenchman, more than 5 pounds less than a German, and 6 pounds less than a Belgian. In short, he was malnourished. But, as they like to boast now, the Russian ruble stood high. Later I will talk about this in more detail, but we can immediately say that under the conditions of Tsarist Russia it was impossible to compare a Russian with a German in consumption, even with a complete refusal to export. The entire exported surplus would have been eaten up before this, that is, food consumption by the Russian masses, at least somehow equal to the European one, could be achieved. There is an anecdote about a general who was inspecting a certain regiment. "Well, how are you guys fed?" "Enough," the inspector asked the soldiers standing in line. "They feed you well, and there's still some left," the formation answered in unison. "What do you do with the leftovers?" Yes, let's finish. For Tsarist Russia this was not a joke, and the fact that the Russian peasant is a forced vegetarian was said from the rostrum of noble congresses. The revolution came, and only after it, having put an end to the civil war and intervention, did Russia finally get its fill for the first time in the mid-20s. At least some bread. Its export was small, 10 times less than the royal one. But without commodity, that is market, grain production, there is no agriculture. There is only the primitive, who could create grain masses in the USSR. Fist, is he a fool? Lots of bread, low prices. Yes, it was beyond the power of the kulaks to create genuine grain abundance. Average. This, although at the end of the 1920s it produced 6 times more marketable grain than the then few collective farms, fed itself primarily. The poor man, albeit a small one, did not feed but was fed. It turned out that the point was not in Stalin's views on the modernization of agriculture but in the strict necessity of this modernization for the future of Russia. That is why the program of Stalin and the Ksp in part of the village turned out to be historically and economically sound. A careful study, with a pencil in hand, of the tables on bread production in Russia and the USSR from the 20th century until the turn of the 1950s convincingly proves Stalin was right. After the excesses and great turning points of the early 1930s, agricultural production of all types in the USSR began to increase sharply and, most importantly, steadily. If history had followed not the real path it took, but the rational one, that is, without a war with the Reich, then by the peaceful years of 1940 to 1943 there would have been no grain problem in the USSR. And by 1947-1948, you see, there would have been no problem with meat. However, Bullock not only discredited Stalin's agricultural policy, but also gave Hitler's policy an unjustifiably flattering assessment of what's up, living basis. He forgot to tell us something here too. In Germany, agriculture has long been a commodity economy. That is, the average peasant worked not for his stomach, but for the market. After all, Germany, compared to Russia, was much better developed by the beginning of the century. However, with Hitler coming to power, the number of large estates measuring over 1,000 hectares, just a decent collective farm, increased by 891 units. And how many of them were there before that? The land area of large farms increased by 3 million hectares. But about 1.5 million peasants went bankrupt, and they were forced to move to cities. There is nothing to be surprised about. The process of consolidation of agricultural farms took place everywhere all over the world, and not just in the USSR. Now let's return once again to Bullock's millions of slaves in the Union mines. True, we seem to have sorted it out with the millions. What about slave labor? Well, reader, here too Bullock's schemes break easily, because they are rotten from the very beginning. The Gulag system in the USSR in the 1930s is a complex phenomenon, and a true, that is honest, historian should approach it with particular care. To show all the ambiguity of that era, I will dwell a little on just one of the tragic Gulag destinies. Fates that ended, by the way, first with release and a few years later with a second arrest and execution. Georgy Ivanovich Porshnev, a very prominent bibliologist, worked and traveled to Germany, and in the early 30s he became a prisoner at Belomor-Kanalstroy. His letters to his daughter, published in 1990, show how difficult things were then. Here is a letter dated April 3, 1932. No aspirations. I have forgotten how to think. My consciousness is not illuminated by dreams. I still believe in the progressive course of the historical process. I admire social construction and I myself participated in it to the best of my ability and understanding, but I am pressed by the collapse of I am disgraced and completely ignored as a person. It would seem that this is the verdict on slave labor from the lips of the slave himself. But the tone of the letter dated May 1 is already different. The world is good. May is a holiday no worse than Easter. its nature is even more gentle, and its meaning is immeasurably greater. Today, even the grimaces of history and the vicissitudes of fate do not bother me. I listen to the surf of public excitement in Moscow, Leningrad, Kharkov. The slaves of Belomorskoye had not only a radio, but also their own newspapers and magazines. SK. I envy those walking in columns and contemplating them, and I rejoice. Yes, the world is good, daughter. It's still too early to die, especially since in our turbulent years there is no peace for the dead, and the letter dated July 4 generally depicts a very strange way of life for a Stalinist slave. Again, dear, I am rummaging through book dust, bathing in the legendary One Go and wandering through the bare mountains. The weather is beautiful, the lake and beaches like in Pretoria are just as charming. A year has passed, and the slave letters take on an absolutely incredible form. You are completely freed from book duty, dear. Very full. In line are Roland, Goth, Block, Tinyanov, Wax Person. My hand reaches out to magazines, KR, November, New World, Zvezda, October, etc. To Reformatsky, technical edition of the book, Google, Bobrikin. I am waiting and looking for Belize masks. Poetry and Truth by Goth Disappointed. That's it. What does it mean? Why do the slaves, and we are talking about a working library for prisoners and civilians, need Tinyanov? Well, if a slave would write about how he was disappointed by the gruel, then everything would be in place. And Goth, well, if he was looking for an extra black cracker, but no, give him a white one. Not bread, but a poet. 3 days later, a new message about a certain discovery. What could make the slave happy this time? A hole in the barbed wire or in the wall of the food pantry? No, I opened Kalevala. Nah, all this can hardly be squeezed into the slave concept, although the tragedy does not cancel. As for our pains, Sir Alan, it's easier for him to be content with Solzhenitsyn's half-fakes. They fit perfectly into his historical concept. Works like Bullock's book, like itself, could be like this, critically turning over page by page. But at the end of the day, I'm writing my own book, not a review of someone else's. And I had to dwell on one of them in such detail so that you, the reader, could to some extent see for yourself how much truth is being written about Stalin and Hitler even half a century after their turbulent, difficult to understand era ended. After all, the historical value of what the Bullocks and Volkaganovs wrote is not zero. Here we are dealing with a sharply negative quantity that actively subtracts the true understanding of history fact by fact from society's perception. Truth after truth. It is easy to find the grossest mistakes in the real Stalin, not to mention the real Hitler, without distorting the past. Moreover, the real Stalin, behind whom are his real historical deeds and their results, and the real Hitler, behind whom are his real historical deeds and their results, are incomparable. The Gulag of Stalin's time was a harsh feature of the time. Auschwitz and Buchenwald were vile. Stalin's Russian soldier stood in the middle of Berlin with a German girl saved from bullets, and German young boys sometimes smashed the heads of the same Russian girls on the door frame. The real Hitler ascended like black soot into the smoky air of the capital of the Reich, and the real Stalin walked in a snow-white tunic through its streets to the Potsdam Conference of the Winners. This cannot be cut out of history, cannot be gnawed out with wolf-like teeth, and cannot be pulled out of it by any oxen, bullock in English ox. We must look at the past and its main political figures not with a dull gaze, not through black, rose-colored or blue glasses. You need to look at them carefully and unprejudicedly in order to see them comprehensively. Only then can past eras be understood correctly, that is, see them as they were, and not turned out to be presented later by crafty or stupid commentators. And then it will be possible to highlight the main thing in the past, and only then can it help us create a better future. Stalin and Hitler, the USSR and the Reich, who actually formed by the summer of 1941, had nothing in common except a common war. And yet they, the real ones, had a chance to find common creation and common peace. The fact that the chance was not used does not negate the fact there was a chance. Chapter 3. The Boy in Pants and the Boy Without Pants. The First World War did not really put Germans and Russians at odds. Although there was no particular warmth between the two peoples, there were no traditions of hostility between them. Hostility, yes, there was. Our great satirist Mikhail Evgrafovich Saltykov-Shchedrin in his essays Abroad cited conversation between a boy in pants and a boy without pants, and I highly recommend that the reader read it in full, and I will give only a couple of excerpts from its beginning and final part. So, in the middle of the highway street of a German village, suddenly an ordinary Russian puddle moved in, from which a Russian boy without pants jumped out to talk with the German boy in pants. The owner extended his hand and greeted the guest. "Hello, boy without pants." The boy without pants, not paying attention to his hand, said, "However, brother, it's clean here." The owner was persistent. "Hello, boy without pants." Stuck like a leaf. "Well, hello. Let me look around first. Look how clean it is, there's nowhere to spit." This is how this significant conversation began, in which the Russian was assertive and the German was demonstrative. At the end, his boy in pants said, "We Germans have an ancient culture, we have solid science, brilliant literature, free institutions, and you pretend as if all this is nothing new to you. You don't have anything like that, you don't even have bread, but when I, on behalf of the Germans, offer you my services, you answer me, 'Take a bite.' Beware, Russian boy. This is arrogance on your part, which is positively not justified by anything." To which the boy without pants responded, "But we, Germans, are tired of you, that's what." They took it in full, and keep it. "You said the truth. You have culture, science, art, and free institutions. But here's what's bad. Who is the most heartless oppressor of the Russian working man? German. Who is the most ruthless teacher? German. Who is the dumbest administrator? German." There was truth behind both. We, Russians, walked to the hammer and Cape Desnev without the Germans. And the Germans looked down on the Russians, not on their partners, but on the Russian masses. However, we had so much laxity that the German composure was often perceived by us with protest, not because of German arrogance, but because of our sloppiness, which neither boys nor men without pants wanted to curtail. We too often relied on the Russian maybe. But the Germans have spent centuries developing daily thoroughness. Alas, the boys never understood each other, never agreed on anything, and ended up like this. Only you, the Germans, have first-class greed, and since you arbitrarily mix this greed with law, you think that you have to gobble up the world. Everyone is afraid of you, no one expects anything from you, except for the catch. There is some reason for this. Of course, from lack of education. An uneducated person is the same as a lower organism, and what can you expect from lower organisms? You see, sausage, you are still nowhere to be seen from the ground, but how can you say that? Sausage, bite it. What intolerable expressions. And you, Russians, still boast about the richness of your language. Meanwhile, the matter is completely clear. For 20 years now, you have been boasting that you are taking gigantic steps forward, and what turns out to be that you are poorer than you have ever been, that no one trusts your solidity, no one counts on either your friendship or your hostility. There is so much pain and bitterness in these words of Shchedrin, put into the mouth of the German boy in pants for the native beloved but so depressingly unlucky Russian people, whose initially active national character was disfigured and broken by centuries of Tatarism, and then by the stupid greed of the Russian ruling layer. But here is another, in fact, documentary evidence of such a deeply Russian person and deeply knowledgeable of Russia as Leonid Pavlovich Sabanev. At the end of the 70s of the 19th century, the famous game manager wrote in his monograph Wolf, "Our peasants, due to a lack of enterprise and also lacking experienced leaders, are almost defenseless from wolves. In addition, our villagers are also extremely careless. An entire village, for example, entrusts its flock to a crippled or wholly fool shepherd or shepherd boy, who, of course, cannot serve as reliable protection in the event of an attack by predators." Meanwhile, in Germany, at the first news of the appearance of a predator, all the huge villages without exception take up arms and launch a proper attack on it. In our country, such persecution is a rare exception, a detail of people's life, and it is also a sign of people's destiny. German Georg Wilhelm Richmann studied at universities in Halle and Jena, and from the age of 24 he lived in St. Petersburg, and was Lomonosov's closest collaborator. At the age of 42 on July 26, 1753, while conducting experiments with an ungrounded thunder machine, he died from a lightning strike on Russian soil in the name of Russian science. Since then, a lot of thunder has subsided over St. Petersburg and over Berlin and over Europe. The First World War died down. In the early 20s, Germany gradually recovered economically, but remained a complete outcast politically. Soviet Russia found itself in a similar situation. The Civil War was practically over. The last invaders, the Japanese, were preparing to leave Russia, and in November 1922, they finally left. But our political isolation was virtually complete. However, the state as such turned out to be divorced from normal official politics, and the political activity of the USSR within the framework of the work of the Communist International was significant, especially in Germany. In May 1921, with a Canadian passport and the party pseudonym Herta Elena Stasova, a relative of all the Stasovs known in Russian history and herself also famous, was sent to work underground in Berlin. Having fictitiously married and received a German passport in the name of Lydia Wilhelm, she spent 5 years in Germany. The German Communist Party never became a decisive force in the working class, but it had a certain influence. German Social Democrats declared that it was impossible to socialize poverty. It is necessary, they say, to first restore working capitalism and then think about social changes. But such views did not suit all the workers, and some of them preferred the communists. The Comintern from Moscow worked on the German Revolution, and Zinoviev and Trotsky were especially active. Already this circumstance contained the double standard policy of the then semi-Trotskyist USSR in relation to Germany. On the one hand, we were preparing the overthrow of the Weimar regime, and on the other, this is what happened with the other. On April 10, 1922, an international economic and financial conference opened in Genoa, Italy. Genoa is the first attempt to find a common language between the West and the RSFSR on the most significant material economic basis. But the West did not want honest settlements, although it slyly offered loans to Russia. As in the time of the unforgettable wit, loans were supposed to play the role of a collar that was easy to put on and difficult to take off. The Englishman Lloyd George was feignedly concerned about the future of Russia. America, according to the ironic remark of a member of our delegation, Raju Taka, was present in Genoa as a watchdog, making sure that no one stole the bone that he considers his right to gnaw. French Minister of War Bartu blasted the Soviets from the conference rostrum, and from it, the speech of the Soviet People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs Georgy Vassilievich Chikarin was made in 2 languages. Actually, Chikarin was guided by Lenin's instructions, and their essence was as follows. Remaining from the point of view of the principles of communism, the Russian delegation recognizes that in the current historical era, which makes possible the parallel existence of the old and the emerging new social system, economic cooperation between the states representing these two property systems is imperative for general economic recovery. It would seem that the proposal was reasonable, but the West insisted on payment of the royal debts and compensation for expropriated property. On April 14 at 10 am, Lloyd George, Bartu, Italian Foreign Minister Schanzer, Belgian Jasper, and our representatives Chikarin, Kresen and Lidwanov met at Villa Albertis. Gentlemen, said Lloyd George, we have decided to organize an informal meeting in order to come to some conclusion. What does Mr. Chikarin think about the program of our experts? Only that it is completely unacceptable either politically or economically. We have to pay 1%, 1.5 billion gold rubles. This is the amount of pre-war Russian exports. But we, gentlemen, also have counterclaims. The conversation continued in this spirit for an hour and a half. Then they decided to take a break until 3 o'clock, and Lloyd George invited everyone to breakfast. But on this day he and his colleagues had to part with Chikarin unsatisfied. We announced that we could substantiate counterclaims for 39 billion gold rubles. If so, there was no point in talking further. All the claims of the Entente instantly sank in this golden sea. The bickering continued, but it became clear that the Genoa conference would end in nothing. The Entente did not want to understand the obvious. The new free Russia had won the right to govern itself, did not recognize the old clamps and would not tolerate new ones. Wanting the impossible, the West got nothing, although we agreed to ensure that the former owners received preferential rights to concessions and leases from us. Then, a week after the start of the conference in the town of Rapallo near Genoa, People's Commissar Chicherin and German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau signed an agreement between the RSFSR and Germany. Chicherin first proposed this agreement to Rathenau on April 4 when our delegation was in Berlin on its way to Italy. Rathenau hoped in Genoa to bargain more with the West on an anti-Soviet position. But complete collapse awaited him there. The Allies did not want to consider Germany as a serious partner. And then the head of the Eastern Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Weimar Republic, Malzen, late at night arranged a historic pajama meeting with Rathenau and his colleagues in the hotel, the result of which was the decision to conclude an agreement called Rapallo. Russia and Germany restore diplomatic and consular relations and most favored nation treatment in trade, economic cooperation and mutual renunciation of all property and financial claims were proclaimed. The Germans refused compensation for Soviet nationalization measures. The Russians refused compensation due to Russia under the Treaty of Versailles. Article 116 of the Versailles Ultimatum Treaty gave Russia the right to reimbursement of war debts at the expense of Germany in the amount of 16 billion gold rubles. In addition, under Article 177 we had the right to reparations. The calculation was not stupid. These not gold, but in fact paper, and no other. Billions, if Russia began to claim them from Germany, would complicate our relations with Germany for many years. However, Russia did not succumb to the Versailles bait. Already in October 1920, Lenin said that the Versailles terms were dictated by robbers with a knife in their hands against a defenseless victim. Soviet Russia did not recognize the Treaty of Versailles from the moment it was signed, and this was the only wise decision. We did not abandon our position in Genoa or Rapallo. The Entente provocation did not work. This will shock the world. This is a major blow to the conference, cried the American ambassador to Italy, Child, upon learning of the news from Rapallo. And the review note on the international situation of Soviet Russia written by Chicherin even before the end of the Genoa conference assessed the situation as follows. If in Genoa we would not have received anything other than a Russian-German treaty, then it was worth coming there because of that. Yes, that's for sure, that's for sure. This is how the new history of new relations between the new Russia and Germany began. The story is complicated and uneven because the idea of close ties between the two countries as before the First World War had many influential enemies both outside and within Germany and Russia. Immediately after the Franco-Belgian occupation of the Ruhr, the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs of the RSFSR sent a note to the German embassy in Moscow on January 17, 1923, which said, "The Russian government, expressing the deep sympathy of the Russian working masses with the German people, is following the course of events with unflagging attention, full of faith into the spiritual power of the German people, which will give them the opportunity to overcome the difficult obstacles placed by the criminal will of the French and Belgian governments on the path of their historical development." And we weren't limited to just notes. Even before Rapallo, our mutual cooperation began to develop, even in such a delicate area as contacts between the Reichswehr and the Red Army. On August 11, 1922, the first temporary agreement between them was concluded, and here is what Lenin wrote to Trotsky in November 1921. Unfortunately, the Germans are too cautious in unofficial economic negotiations. SK. We need to ask the question point blank and precise. What do you want from us? Treaty without England. With pleasure. Give us the project quickly and we will sign it. Yes, the Germans were careful. Only on March 23, 1922, the RSFSR, after a number of hesitations on the German side and our threats to reduce the German quota in the Soviet order for steam locomotives, handed over to the Friedrich Krupp Company in Essen 50,000 D-18s in the Solsky district of the Don province for a period of 24 years for the maintenance of rational agriculture. Krupp settled there with all its equipment and facilities, and as payment transferred to the Soviet side a fifth of the harvest, but most importantly, experience. This agricultural concession existed on the Don until October 1934. In May 1921, also before Rapallo, trade representative of the RSFSR Boris Stamoniakov and board member of the well-known Hamburg American Joint Stock Company of Merchant Shipping Company Theodor Ritter signed a protocol on the creation of the Russian-German Transport Company Derutra, the first of a number of such joint companies. By the way, the business was so profitable that the concern of William Averell Harriman quickly grabbed half of its share from the Hamburg America line. We did not object, our votes were retained, but for the first time direct ties were established with American big capital. The thing, to say the least, is not superfluous. On January 23, 1922, referring to the upcoming Genoa conference, Lenin wrote, "It would be infinitely important for us to conclude at least one, or even better, several concession agreements with German companies." And on January 26, he sent Smilga, then the head of the main fuel directorate, to Berlin a fierce coded message. "For reasons not only economic, but also political, we absolutely need a concession with the Germans in Grozny, and if possible, in other fuel centers. If you sabotage, I'll consider it a crime." And spurred on by Smilga and Stamoniakov, on January 31, they talk with representatives of Deutsche Bank about oil concessions throughout Grozny and Baku. And at the same time, Zinoviev's Comintern was preparing a revolution in Germany. The future Soviet intelligence officer Sandor Rado, sent from Moscow to Germany, was then the chief of staff and leader of the proletarian hundreds in Leipzig. He had a sealed package in his hands which he could open only after the arrival of a special party courier. According to Rado's later descriptions, the plan was as follows: to raise armed detachments simultaneously in the north, in Hamburg, and in central Germany, in Leipzig and Halle. After capturing these three cities, advance on Berlin. It was planned to create a defensive line against reactionary Bavaria in the Thuringian Mountains. On the night of October 22-23, Rado was waiting for the courier. At illegal assembly points, thousands of Leipzig workers waited with guns in their hands for Rado's signal. But at 1:30 in the morning the order came not to perform. The General Congress of German Factory Committees, which met in Chemnitz, did not dare to issue a cry. And only in Hamburg, where the courier was late, on October 23, under the leadership of Th. Mann, workers and sailors went to the barricades, but the uprising was suppressed. By the way, in half a month Adolf Hitler will also unsuccessfully perform in the beer hall putsch in the Bavarian capital of Munich. By mid-1923, Lenin was already seriously ill. In fact, the country and the party were increasingly led by Stalin, but the influential Trotsky, Zinoviev and circles of the party elite close to them did everything to overthrow Stalin. His authority was already greatly hindering their permanent revolutionary adventurism and increasingly turned Russia to face not Europe, but to itself. Stalin assessed the prospects of the German Revolution of 1923 as Trotsky called it, coolly. In August 1923, he wrote to Zinoviev and Bukharin, "Should the communists strive at this stage to seize power without the social democrats, whether they are already ripe for this, in my opinion, is the question. When we took power, we had such reserves in Russia as A. Peace, B. Land for the peasants, C. The support of the vast majority of the working class, D. The sympathy of the peasantry. The German communists have nothing like that. Of course, they have the Soviet country next door, but what can we give them at the moment?" Once, in 1918, Trotsky and Bukharin were ready to lose Soviet power in the name of the German Revolution, without which the Russian Revolution, in their opinion, would lose its meaning. Now this bad story was repeating itself, and Zinoviev was also drawn into it. Here one could already discern a system and deliberate evil will. After all, the communists in Germany could only cause unrest. They had no conditions for victory. The newly formed USSR had not yet recovered from the failures of the Polish War, and we simply would not have been able to break through to Germany through Poland. The people, peasants for the most part, would not understand or accept such a revolutionary war. And what Trotsky, Zinoviev and Bukharin insisted on was among the sweetest dreams of the most vicious enemies of the new socialist Russia. Lloyd George was one of our enemies even before the revolution, because a man of his political destiny could not relate to Russia in any other way. Alarmed by the Rapallo factor, he believed, the greatest danger at the moment is that Germany can throw in its lot with the Bolsheviks and put its material and intellectual resources, all its enormous organizational talent at the service of revolutionary fanatics. Such a danger is not a chimera. And Lloyd George was not the only one who thought so. Of course, the cunning Englishman exaggerated, but nothing more. He accurately outlined the overall future picture. It was Germany's potential and its economy that played an outstanding role in the creation of a powerful Soviet economy. Later, we will see this later, Lloyd George himself had enough political experience to understand what was what, but perhaps he was subconsciously worried because he was tormented by long-standing anxieties from the pre-war era. After all, back in 1904, English readers were excited by the translation of August Niemann's book World War, The German Dream. There was also a subtitle, The Conquest of England. One of the ideas of the book was a continental union between Germany and Russia. And after the First World War, in 1918, a book by the German professor W. Dye, who preached the new triple alliance of the 20th century, Germany, Russia and Japan, was popular in Germany. The German professor was smart, to be sure. A direct union between Soviet Russia and Weimar Germany was, of course, impossible, and this hardly needs to be proven in detail. But since the mid-20s, the long-forgotten breadth has gradually been restored in our mutual relations. Russians and Germans are beginning to cooperate in such a sensitive area as the military. There is now a lot of speculation around this topic, but it is enough to get acquainted with the top secret, of course, then, report of the head of the Intelligence Directorate of the Red Army Headquarters, Jan Burzin, dated December 24, 1928, on cooperation between the Red Army and the Reichswehr to understand. Our military contacts were, although stable and mutually beneficial, but quite modest, and yet they were. A joint tank school in Kazan, an aviation school in Lipetsk, the Tomka chemical station, the exchange of academic ideas and mutual acquaintance with military construction. Krupp now traded with us not only steam locomotives but also military technologies. A Russian department appeared in his design bureau in Essen, and German designers worked in the USSR. However, in the 20s Russia was just gathering strength for an industrial breakthrough, and the Germans then supplied us not so much with industrial equipment as with finished industrial goods. And there was still more to come. Zinoviev's activity in Germany also began to subside. It increasingly acquired a Trotskyist character and increasingly harmed Soviet-German relations. In the German Communist Party, the group of Ruth Fischer and Maslow prevailed, whom Trotsky praised avidly, so that the member of the organizing bureau of the Central Committee, Comrade Herta, that is Elena Stasova, did not have to sleep. In December 1925, through malice, she drew Stalin's attention to Zinoviev's mistakes and even to the deliberate misinformation that he supplied to the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks. Stasova proposed to recall her to Moscow to rectify the situation, and from February 1926 she already worked in the Information Bureau of the Central Committee. Through the common efforts of the majority of members of the Politburo, Zinoviev, Trotsky and the Comintern were somehow short-lived for a while. People's Minister Chikarin was also indignant at Zinoviev's policies. Georgy Vasilievich was not just an extraordinary figure, but integral and contradictory at the same time. It could hardly have been otherwise for a man who, by upbringing and origin, belonged to the propertied stratum, and from the age of 33 devoted himself entirely to the cause of liberation of the poor people from exploitation. He was born in 1872 into an old and noble family of a rather wealthy Tambov landowner. My father was a retired diplomat, and in general the Chicorin family was classified as diplomatic. Its founder, the Italian Ciccorini, came to Moscow in 1472 in the retinue of the Byzantine princess Zoe Paleologus, the wife of Ivan I, Queen Sofia. The uncle of the future proletarian People's Commissar Boris Chicorin was a famous historian and leader of the Russian liberal nobility, and the nephew himself graduated from the Faculty of History and Philology of St. Petersburg University and began serving in the main archive of the Russian Foreign Ministry. He was a polyglot and a brilliant musician. Already in the 20s, the first German ambassador to the USSR, Count Brockdorff-Rantzau, once organized a dinner in honor of the famous Berlin pianist who was touring in Moscow. The maestro kindly played something technically difficult. Chicorin, immediately sitting down at the piano, received applause louder than a professional virtuoso, and the guests clapped for him not out of diplomatic politeness. The People's Commissar simply played better. The former elegant lover of well-dressed began to wear reddish lionfish, and after the revolution he put on a tunic. A gourmet and connoisseur of expensive wines became a vegetarian and a teetotaler. A subtle researcher of Mozart's work spent days unraveling dubious diplomatic knots imposed by the West. But you can't get away from yourself. Just as Chicorin did not cultivate toughness in himself, he was a soft personality and sometimes dangerously compliant. On January 20 and 22, 1922, he proposed this in letters to Lenin. If the Americans are very persistent with the demand for representative institutions, SK, don't you think that it would be possible to include in our constitution for decent compensation small change? Chicorin had in mind the representation of parasitic elements in the Soviets, for example, Nepmin priests. Lenin underlined the words "it was possible" 4 times, put 3 question marks in the margins, and then added, "madness." Vladimir Ilyich wanted to immediately and forcibly exile Chicorin to a sanatorium, but it ended up being the People's Commissar who became the actual head of the delegation, and our delegation in Genoa was obliged not to deviate from detailed instructions. Lenin, the nominal head of the delegation, developed them in such detail and cleverly that all possible moves of the Entente and the Germans were taken into account by him in advance. But what we couldn't take away from Chicorin was the breadth and depth of his foreign policy views and the validity of his diplomatic concepts. He knew diplomatic history from the cradle. He didn't so much study it as absorb it, playfully, in the literal sense of the word, during children's games while adults were talking. And therefore, on the one hand, he warned against underestimating England's hostility towards us, and on the other, he spoke about the importance for us of good relations with Germany. He treated France as it was required of a nationally minded Russian diplomat, that is, as France. On October 26, 1925, Chicorin wrote a letter to French Prime Minister Édouard Herriot, who restored diplomatic relations with us. I will quote this letter in full, reader, because it can be considered a model. There is not a single specific thought here that obliges us to France, but everything is impeccable from the point of view of diplomatic loyalty. Dear Chairman and friend, in 3 days it will be the anniversary of the significant event in which you were a participant, when the wall that you destroyed that separated our countries collapsed. What you did will go down in the history of relations between our countries. Every beginning is difficult, especially if the obstacles are so numerous. The first steps along the new path you discovered were overshadowed by numerous clouds, but it could not have been otherwise. But you can already feel the power of the idea that inspired you, which will have an impact entirely in the future. The unforgettable role you played has forever created strong and lasting bonds between us. I firmly count on your cooperation in the future in the unification of our peoples and in the cause of peace. Accept, my dear Chairman and friend, the sincere assurances of my unfailing and deep friendship and my high regard for you. Georgy Chicorin. Chicorin went to bed at 7 o'clock in the morning and slept until noon. Then he worked all night, even audiences with ambassadors were sometimes scheduled at night. This did not suit everyone, but Count Brockdorff-Rantzau often visited at night. He himself loved night working hours. Both lovers of science and philosophy, connoisseurs of music and literature, the Soviet People's Commissar and the German Count sat up until the morning in a free and pleasant conversation after official business. But politics was determined not by anyone's personal sympathies but by historical realities, if, of course, statesmen knew how to see them. Both Lenin, Stalin, and Chicherin knew how to see them, and during Chicherin's time the general German line was maintained so well that Germany refused any adventures that could worsen relations with the USSR. This was well proven by the history of the Rhine Pact in Locarno. It started like this. By the end of 1924, Germany had strengthened a little, but was still completely dependent on the will of the former Entente. Naturally, the Germans wanted to somehow change their situation for the better. France occupied the border Rhineland of Germany and could freely enter the internal German regions at any time. And France was also afraid of Germany. On January 28, 1925, Duard Harriet, to the stormy applause of the Chamber of Deputies, declared that the military occupation of the Rhineland was the only guarantee of France and that the disarmament of Germany was a pure fiction. Harriet was wrong. The Entente disarmed the Germans thoroughly, although not as deeply as they would have liked. But it was clear that both France and Germany were not averse to developing some new treaty obligations different from those of Versailles. England had its own calculations here, and on January 19, the English ambassador in Berlin, Lord D'Abernon, invited the German Secretary of State Schubert to come up with an initiative on security guarantees. I think you would be wise to take up this immediately. Schubert thought it possible to joke. Well, as the representative of Germany, I pose this question to you right now. No, D'Abernon shook his head. England believes that your demarques, especially simultaneous ones in London and Paris, are inappropriate. Contact me with a memorandum of trust similar to the Rhine Pact that Kuno already proposed in the 22nd year. What role does England assign itself? Arbiter. Alas, the British wanted to be not only an arbiter but also an instigator, increasing Soviet-German ties and even economic ones. Neither London nor Washington needed it. In November 1924, Baldwin became Prime Minister of England, and on February 20, 1925, his Foreign Secretary Austen Chamberlain, brother of the more famous Neville, wrote in a secret note, "Russia hangs like a thundercloud over the eastern horizon of Europe, threatening, incalculable, but before completely isolated." Chamberlain obviously believed that only England could have permanent interests but not permanent allies. Only England could be isolated, but Russia, if it was not under Anglo-Saxon control, already threatened Europe. And then Chamberlain's hypocrisy even paled before his aggressiveness. Russia is not only not a factor of stability, it is rather one of the most dangerous moments that gives rise to our insecurity. Therefore, it is necessary to define a security policy in spite of Russia and even, perhaps, precisely because of Russia. The note soon became public, the threat was transparent, and Chicherin, of course, had reason to declare on June 30, 1925, the entire Guarantee Pact campaign was launched by England in connection with the desire to isolate the USSR, tear Germany away from it, and create a united front against it. Chicherin hardly thought completely as he wrote in his Vestia, but he blamed England correctly. France and Germany were objectively interested in guarantees, but the main goal of England was really the revival of active and aggressive European anti-Sovietism, firstly, and the discord between Russians and Germans, secondly. These goals could even be swapped in order of priority. So Chicherin's public demarque immediately warned Germany against ill-considered steps, and even before Chicherin's article, things were going as usual. On February 9, the Germans handed Harriet their still secret memorandum. Considering the various possibilities that now present themselves for resolving the security issue, one could proceed from an idea similar to the one that underlay the proposal made in December 1922 by Mr. Kuno, then Reich Chancellor. Germany could, for example, accede to a pact in which the powers interested in the Rhineland, namely England, France, Italy and Germany, would give each other and the United States government a solemn undertaking not to fight each other for a long period, which will be determined later. Such a pact could be supplemented by an agreement on expanded arbitration between Germany and France. The French agreed, and in the fall the Locarno agreements, adopted at a conference held from October 5 to 16, were initialed in Locarno, Switzerland. The basic ideas here were the same as in the German memorandum, only Belgium was added to the countries that signed the Rhine Guarantee Pact. The United States formally remained on the sidelines, and England and Italy became the guarantor powers. In addition, Franco-German, German-Belgian, German-Polish and German-Czechoslovak arbitration treaties were signed. However, in our story all this is just a saying. What is important for us now is that in Locarno they really tried to push Germany into hostility with the USSR and put a lot of pressure on it, but the Germans resisted. They even immediately concluded a separate agreement with us to prove to us that they did not undertake any anti-Soviet obligations in Locarno. We will remember this agreement, reader, more than once. A reliable way to understand the atmosphere of an era, including the Locarno situation, is to turn to the testimony of a competent and active participant in the era. In 1926, People's Commissar of Education Anatoly Vasilievich Lunacharsky came to Berlin, and it will be useful for us, my dear reader, to get acquainted with some of his Berlin impressions. Here's what, for example, the outstanding German Orientalist, also the former Minister of Public Education, Friedrich Schmidt-Art, told him. You say that the streets of Berlin are demilitarized, but how sad it is. In my opinion, there is no greater harm, no greater humiliation that can be inflicted on a people than to deprive them of their army. Do not think that I am saying this from the point of view of some kind of restoration of imperialism. At this moment I don't even mean defense, but the colossal educational significance of the army. You can be congratulated on having your Red Army. We know very well how successfully you use it to educate your working and especially peasant youth. Of course, the education of our army would be completely different in many respects, but raising physical culture, general mental level and awareness of one's connection with the whole remains. Having lost the army, we have lost one of the methods of national education. Actually, of all the great nations in modern times, only two looked at the role of the army in this way, German and Soviet. In his letters from Berlin, which were published in Krasnaya Gazeta, Lunacharsky admired. In Berlin, work is in full swing everywhere, and the whole of Berlin resembles an improved factory, where almost the entire population works concentrated, organized and diligently, as if trying to grind their own with this work. Cruel fate, and added, and in terms of culture, the Germans work hard and interestingly. At the same time, Lunacharsky wrote, the vast majority of Germans, especially the intelligentsia, treat the Union, firstly, as a political support, and secondly, as a country where an exceptional and exciting experiment is being carried out. And here are his lines directly related to Locarno. The discussion in the Reichstag of the Locarno Treaty deeply excited the whole of Berlin, dividing it into different camps and, to varying degrees, arousing in all of them an even more acute interest in Russia. Lunacharsky Narkom Prose reported that the Locarno disagreements cut Berlin into four large groups. I hope, dear reader, that you will be interested to know that besides, of course, the communists, those who opposed the Locarno ideas most vehemently were the right, that is, the nationalists. They saw in Locarno the final surrender of Germany to the mercy of England, and as Lunacharsky wrote, this forced them, even in the most reactionary circles, to somehow frantically grab onto the Soviet Union, which, thanks to the political situation, became, as it were, the only support in the upcoming vicissitudes of the vassal existence of Germany. The circles that supported the government, that is, the Locarnists themselves, essentially agreed with the right. Minister of State Economy Hans von Raumer said this to a guest from Moscow. You understand that the clearer for us the inevitability of the Locarno agreement, the more sharply we must emphasize the immutability of our friendship with the Union. Indeed, Romer then structured his public report on the trade agreement with the USSR as a deliberate demonstration of the preservation and development of the best relations between Germany and Russia. It remains to inform the reader that the only major political group that, according to Lunacharsky, admired the prospects of Locarno and continued its policy of malicious grumbling against the Soviets were the German Social Democrats. Lunacharsky, perhaps without realizing it himself but simply due to his penchant for literary precision, showed into details the vileness of his colleague Litvinov's future disposition towards the French, as well as the unfoundedness of his coldness towards the Germans even in Weimar times. These are the details, one Berlin and the other Parisian, noted by Anatoly Vasilievich. I will note the extraordinary courtesy of the German and Prussian governments. At the reception given by our embassy on the occasion of my arrival, along with representatives of science, literature, theater, and the press, there were many members of the government, starting with Reich Chancellor Luther and Prussian Minister President Otto Braun. This is how Russian envoys were greeted in Berlin. And here it is in Paris. A small point. In Paris there was also a reception, moreover, dedicated not to a random guest. In fact, Lunacharsky stayed in Berlin on his way to Paris SK, but to Comrade Chicherin, and celebrated the presentation of his credentials by our plenipotentiary envoy to the President. All the elements I listed above, i.e., science, literature, etc., SK, were represented here, but there was not a single minister. By the way, Lunacharsky's report on the cultural state of the USSR was made in the crowded Great Hall of the Berlin Conservatory, and the President of the Reichstag, Social Democrat Paul Lieb, presided over the evening. In 1933 he would openly support Hitler. In honor of the Soviet People's Commissar, German scientists organized a special breakfast where out of no less than 100 people sitting at the table, each was the owner of a big name. Speakers included Max Planck, Schmidt-Art, the great historian of religions Harnack, but then the famous historian and expert on Russia, Professor Otto Goch, stood up and made a speech which he ended like this. In this difficult hour, almost at the very hour when the fate of the Locarno Agreement is being decided, I personally, an enemy of this agreement, would like on behalf of the scientists gathered here, who have different attitudes towards him, to assure our guest that for all of us the deep benefit and even the absolute necessity of the most serious reliance on each other of our peoples is equally clear. The difference in social system cannot in any way prevent this. Without interfering in the internal affairs of your country, we sincerely wish it peace and growth, confident that its revival and growing power can only be a source of good for the German people. Such words were a bone in someone's throat, a pitchfork in the side, a stumbling block, and an incentive to action that was driven by ideas directly opposed to the ideas of Professor Goch and his colleagues, Lunacharsky's dinner companions. Our contacts in the 20s and later were so wide that the German ambassador in Moscow von Dirksen later admitted, I don't think that any country before or now had such detailed information material about the Soviet Union as Germany did in those years. Why was the German embassy at the turn of the 20s and 30s and later so well informed about Russia? Dirksen himself answered this question. The engineers scattered throughout Russia were a valuable source of information for me. Someone will say this is espionage, but the German engineers firstly maintained contacts with the embassy quite openly, and secondly, and this was the most significant, they were officially invited to us and actively participated in the implementation of the Soviet 5-year plans. On September 4, 1928, the Committee of the German Economy for Russia was created in Berlin, and in its report for the 1929-30 business year it was stated, a special chapter is provided by the consultation of specialists who want to go to Russia. Since the summer of 1929, consultation, written and oral, has been received by about 1,100 specialists, mostly engineers. as well as chemists, architects, craftsmen, skilled workers, and in some cases farmers, foresters, and scientists. I hope, my dear reader, that this quote is eloquent enough in itself. Let me just draw your attention to the fact that 1929 was only a year of preparation for the broad socialist reconstruction of Russia. And even in this not yet shock year, Germany sent the Soviets an entire full-strength shock engineer battalion. This was the case in 1929. What were the moods of the Germans later? Well, let's say February 1931. President of the German Society for the Study of Eastern Europe Schmidt since 1920 and a member of the Supervisory Board of Igfarben, familiar to us from his conversations with Anatoly Vasilievich Lunacharsky, writes a letter to the Minister of Foreign Affairs Julius Kershis, who will succeed Schmidt as President of the Society through year. I have always believed that I have the right to consider all the activities of the Society as promoting the development of our relations with Russia. Perhaps it's worth immediately asking the following question. What was it like there even later, in Nazi times? Well, let's take the Society's memorandum for April 1933 and read. In relation to the Soviet Union, the Society, both its responsible leaders and ordinary employees, took a position exactly corresponding to the line formulated in the speech of Herr Reich Chancellor Hitler, delivered in the Reichstag on March 23, 1933. Cultivating good relations with Russia while fighting against communism in Germany. It was the destruction of communism in Germany that cleared the way for good relations with Russia, which are no longer hampered by internal political obstacles. However, we will still have a reason and opportunity to dwell on these years in the future. So far, the calendar of European politics has been the era of Weimar Germany, increasingly actively cooperating with the pre-5-year Soviet Union. In this Germany, not everyone was happy to cooperate not just with Russians but with Soviet Russians. There were many Germans who would very much like friendship with Russia, but out of their heartfelt inclination they sought to maintain acquaintance with the non-communist circles of the Moscow public. However, they also had to make sure that there were such circles, but these circles had no prospects, especially if we keep in mind the economic prospects. The prospects for Soviet-German relations were obviously good, which frightened both our European ill-wishers and, of course, the powerful American ill-wishers who were already thinking about a new European war in the 1920s. Strange as it may be, they wanted to destroy our then German ties not only in London and Washington, but also in Moscow and in the communist circles of Berlin. Chicherin was getting sick more and more often, but he was always treated in Germany and could observe the situation up close. On June 3, 1927, he wrote from Frankfurt to Stalin and Reich, the Communist parties treat the existence of the USSR in the most frivolous way, as if they do not need it. Now, when for the sake of the existence of the USSR it is necessary to strengthen the position primarily in Berlin, the Executive Committee of the Comintern (SK) finds nothing better than to disrupt our work with attacks against Germany, spoiling everything completely. There was such an interesting story with this letter, reader, that it is necessary to dwell on it at least in parentheses. When Khrushchev needed to slander Stalin in Izvestia on December 4, 1962, extracts from the letter appeared in Izvestia on December 4, 1962, without specifying the addressee, with comments about the fact that Chicherin had expressed dissatisfaction with Stalin. So, according to Khrushchev's fake, it turned out that Stalin was complained about himself, and this same fake was reproduced by the post-perestroika slanderer of Stalin, Fyodor Volkov, in his book The Rise and Fall of Stalin. Although Chicherin clearly indicated the direction of his indignation, hooliganized Comintern, prostituted Narkomindel, the Zinovievites are in charge of affairs. Instead of Chicherin, Maxim Litvinov now remained, and he only played along with such a hooligan policy of the HE. Moreover, Litvinov was inclined to focus on England, and this was not an accidental delusion. Maxim Maximovich Chicherin hated him fiercely and tried in every possible way to discredit him. And this was not accidental either, but we will still have more than enough time to talk about Litvinov. Reader, let's return to Chicherin, who at the end of the 1920s was already living out his last days as a people's commissar. Stalin was not the reason for this. Understanding perfectly well the complexity of the situation with Chicherin, he nevertheless clearly stated that Georgy Vasilievich should be the people's commissar even if he works for 2 hours. But at the end of the 20s, Stalin himself was still far from omnipotent, and the intrigue against Chicherin was carried out powerful, cunning, purely Trotskyist in methods. Chicherin proposed appointing Molotov in his place, but the secret elite alliance of Trotskyist and Zinovievite comrades within the party pushed Litvinov forward, and the future will show that there were special and far-sighted, for the enemies of Russia, reasons for this. On October 18, 1929, Chicherin wrote to Molotov, "I am extremely worried about the disastrous leadership of the Comintern, the desire of Moscow to spoil relations with Germany at all costs to please Th-Man." And even earlier, he informs Stalin, "I consider it deeply false when the international position of the USSR is undermined and endangered only so that Comrade Th-Man's poorly adhered agitation can go a little better." Stalin understood him perfectly, although Litvinov and the Trotskyists from the GPU criticized Chicherin in front of Stalin in vain. But Stalin simply did not have the opportunity to be seriously distracted by external affairs. The first 5-year plan began. Its success or failure determined everything, both the position of the USSR and the position of Stalin himself. Therefore, having fought to the point of blood for his internal line, the only saving line for the country, Stalin did not yet have the strength for his equally unmistakably correct external line. For now, all he could demand from foreign policy was to ensure the supply of foreign technology and equipment for the needs of the future 5-year plan. On November 19, 1928, Stalin spoke at the plenum of the Central Committee. The question of the rapid pace of industrial development would not be as acute for us as it is now if we had the same developed industry and the same developed technology as, say, in Germany, if the share of industry in the entire national economy stood as high here as, for example, in Germany. The fact of the matter is that we stand behind Germany in this respect and we are far from catching up with it in technical and economic terms. The question of the rapid pace of industrial development would not be so acute if we represented not the only country of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but one of the countries of the proletarian dictatorship. Under this condition, the question of the economic independence of our country would naturally recede into the background. We could join the system of more developed proletarian states. We could receive from them machines to fertilize our industry and agriculture, supplying them with raw materials and food products. But you know that we do not have this condition. That is why Lenin posed the question of catching up and overtaking economically advanced countries as a matter of life and death for our development. Weimar Germany was not a country of proletarian dictatorship, but our economic relations increasingly resembled the scheme that Stalin spoke about at the plenum. Only instead of ready-made machines, or rather, together with them, we received from Germany more and more industrial equipment that would allow us to quickly produce our own machines. The USA and England often did not want to do this. France could not because of its progressive backwardness. We could build the economic basis of socialism only with the help of the Germans. But our markets were then of paramount importance for the Germans. This circumstance was so obvious that it strengthened our relations better than any individuals, and no individuals at that moment could seriously interfere with the Soviet-German ties and disrupt them. That is why Stalin not only reassured the sick Chicherin, but stated a fact when he wrote to him on May 31, 1929. I receive all your letters and I send most of them to members of the authority for information. Due to the overload due to all sorts of congresses, I could not answer you until now. I apologize. When are you planning to return to Moscow to work? It would be good to return immediately after completing the course of treatment in Wiesbaden. What do you have to say about this? I think that despite a number of tactlessness committed by our people in relation to the Germans, there are no less tactlessness of the Germans in relation to the USSR. Things will go well with the Germans. They desperately need large industrial orders, among other things, in order to pay reparations. But that is, orders are not lying around on the street, and it is known that we could give them important orders. Things should go well with the Germans. With Stalin. Stalin wrote respectfully and relying on Chicorin as an active bayonet. But Georgy Vasilievich's delicate, nervous nature could not withstand the already organized persecution, and his persecutors achieved their goal. On July 21, 1930, Chicorin was relieved of his post as People's Commissar, and on July 22, Litvinov was appointed People's Commissar. Soviet foreign policy was destined to have an outwardly brilliant period, but in reality it was a dark period. Anticipating this, Chicorin wrote a huge memo in early July, judging by its tone and meaning, to his successor, whom he clearly saw Molotov to be. Having learned about the victory of the Litvinov clique, Chicorin undoubtedly should have sent something similar to Stalin and the same Molotov, but for reasons unclear, nothing reached these addressees. And Chicorin was fairly perspicacious in this document, and we need to know something from his last notes so that future events appear before us not in a distorted, but in their true meaning. Chicorin began with unflattering words addressed to his deputy, Litvinov, and flattering ones addressed to one of the long-time Soviet diplomats, Karakan. Chicorin was very short with the latter, but he himself once wrote about him. Beautiful appearance and good cigars. About the member of the Nkid board Stamoniakov it was said this way. Stamoniakov is a dry formalist without political flair, pugnacious, unpleasant, spoiling relationships. The portrait, it must be said, is typical of a Trotskyist. By the way, Chicorin defined Litvinov's favorite Urinov as a Trotskyist. Soon Litvinov will make the press a means of causing first bewilderment, then irritation, and then even embitterment of the Germans against the increasingly incompetent and arrogant Litvinov's foreign policy towards Germany. Things have long been unfavorable with our correspondents in Berlin, and Chicorin warned. The plenipotentiary representative must check the telegrams sent to Moscow from TASS representatives. But Comrade Krestinsky, at that time plenipotentiary representative in Berlin, SK, stubbornly shirked. Both the work was unnecessary and the responsibility. Both the Berlin correspondent of TASS and the two glib Kate from Izvestia constantly harm our politics. Krestinsky, who does not want, must be forced to control them. And one of the most important issues is the control of the Nkid over the press. Several times I directly saved the situation when some idiot from the Fraternal Communist Party pushed through monstrous absurdity. For example, Remmel gave an article to Pravda stating that, according to irrefutable information, Germany received the right to triple the size of the Reichswehr and for this joined the anti-Soviet front. This childish lie was terribly harmful, pure provocation. Obviously the ignoramuses from the wanted to reinforce Thalmann's usual lies with this wild nonsense. If I hadn't stopped this nasty thing, there would have been a huge scandal. It was no coincidence that Georgy Vasilievich was especially worried about the Berlin correspondents. It was there that our most important threats to the outside world were located, and it was there that it was easy to tear them, but not easy to tie them up again. Litvinov was just about to tear it up, and he did, having actually replaced Chicorin for about 2 years, who was indignant. The most vandalistic act was the destruction of Comrade Michalski's Berlin bureau. Some bodies behind the scenes intrigues unknown to me led to this. The bureau's constant enemies were Comrades Litvinov and Krestinsky, and Comrade Michalski's enemies Unschlicht. Michalski's bureau quite legally collected various political and economic information right in the thick of things, processing literature, establishing personal contacts in all circles. It was, according to Chicorin, exemplary. but Litvinov, his future deputy Krestinsky, and Unschlick did not need accurate information about Germany. They needed tendentious anti-German materials, and the glib journalist Kate did an excellent job with this. And it was not out of laziness that Krestinsky evaded control over the press. The meaning here was different. The appearance of detachment from the kid allowed Moscow newspapermen to act more freely and independently in Berlin, that is, provocatively. And the embassy only threw up its hands in front of the Germans. They say, freedom of the press. Chicherin believed that the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs should always be on site and recalled that 80-year-old Gortkov was woken up at night because of an urgent telegram, and 75-year-old Lobanov went down to the office in the middle of the night to send an urgent telegram to see what received. Under Chicherin this was the case, but Litvinov introduced a purely clerical style. He arrived exactly at 9 and left exactly at 6. The departing Chicherin had another pain, the Comintern. Chicherin wrote, "Of our, as we know jokingly put it, internal enemies, the first is the Comintern." Until 1929, although there were a lot of troubles with him, he managed to settle the situation. Since 1929 the situation has become completely unbearable. It is the death of foreign policy. Max Goltz received the Red Banner for a crime against the friendly German government. Goltz was awarded by order of the Revolutionary Military Council of the USSR No. 578 SK. In 1928, the question was raised about removing foreign communists from our embassies, trade missions, various economic institutions, banks and TASS offices. In Berlin, the entire active party of the party was in our institutions. It was a form of party financing. Our radio broadcasting is a terrible disgrace. When, during German strikes, the powerful radio station of the Executive Committee of the Comintern in Moscow calls in German on strikers to fight, or when it calls on German soldiers to disobey, this is something unacceptable. No international relations are possible under such conditions. Chicherin reasoned here like a true Russian Soviet patriot. The foreign relations of the USSR should strengthen not the communist parties abroad, but the positions of the USSR. But Litvinov and those who stood behind him were quite satisfied with such conditions in Germany, under which our normal policy in Germany was impossible. The Comintern in Germany was a good tool for organizing the breakdown of interstate relations. On July 26, 1930, Maxim Maximovich, democratically sitting on the porch of the Kid mansion on Spiridonova, gave his first interview to foreign correspondents in the rank of People's Commissar. He was immediately asked, "Mr. Litvinov, won't the new appointment lead to changes in foreign policy?" "No, I had an experienced predecessor, and he and I actively worked together on the same thing." But already from Maxim Maximovich's first speech from the throne it was clear that there would be changes in policy. Although he has been the de facto People's Commissar for many years, performing duties and being a full-fledged owner are still different things. And now, having received complete freedom, Litvinov immediately showed his teeth to Germany. Formally, he did not name any country, but said this: "We do not hide the fact that while implementing our growing economic development, we would like to count on the further expansion of economic ties with other states. But here we encounter the opposing aspirations of individual hostile capitalist groups. Their efforts seem to be directed mainly against our exports, but in fact against our entire foreign trade turnover, since a reduction in our exports would inevitably lead to a corresponding reduction in our imports." It was said cunningly. Germany has become not just our main trading partner, but the overwhelmingly main one. The vastness of connections means inevitable misunderstandings. This has already happened once in relations between Russia and Germany in the last century. And then it was precisely the export-import troubles that helped the enemies of Russian-German friendship separate us and tie Russia to France, then to the Entente, and in the end to a world war that was disastrous and unnecessary for Russia. Now there were dim prospects that everything could happen again, and Lidwin's hidden threats even in the first interview could not help but alarm the Germans. Moreover, for the last 2 years Chicherin had almost no influence on the affairs of the Kid. All operational work was carried out under the hands of Litvinov, and the more firmly Litvinov sat in his chair, the worse our German affairs became. But imports from Germany were of a special kind. We imported from there our independent future, our industrial power. Of course, we had to fight for our exports, but threaten. This approach backfired primarily on us. This did not bother Litvinov and the new cohort of Litvinovites. Since the end of 1929, under the influence of Litvinov, the coloring of the Berlin conversations of our plenipotentiary Krestinsky and his deputy Brodowski with the state secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Schubert and the Minister of Foreign Affairs Sergius has become drier, more official, and more picky about minor details. Accordingly, nervousness arises in the Moscow conversations of Litvinov and Stamoniakov with the German ambassador von Dirksen, and their main topic is not economic ties but Soviet complaints about the tone of German newspapers which allegedly led anti-Soviet persecution. Izvestia on April 24, 1930, in the editorial dedicated to the 4-year anniversary of the Berlin Soviet-German Treaty, did not find any kinder words except these. The entire tactics of the German government boil down to piling up claims aimed at retroactively justifying the malice of the German press and the vicious anti-Soviet performances. This phrase could be taken as an epigraph to Litvinov's entire German policy for many years, although the face of Trotskyist Zinoviyevist Moscow was very much in the dust. Numerous Soviet institutions in Germany were indeed used as support bases of the German Communist Party. On February 19, 1930, the plenipotentiary representative in Germany Krestinsky, after a 10-week break, met with the State Secretary of the Außenamt, German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Schubert. They met outwardly warmly, but the conversation immediately turned to the trial of the fake Chervenets case. In Germany, a gang of counterfeiters associated with the Georgian Mensheviks was uncovered. They were judged mildly, but what about the USSR? Noise in the newspapers, subtle hints at the Soviets' involvement in the cause. That's what the free press is for. Moreover, the USSR may have carried out some actions with counterfeit dollars back then, and the press's hints must have had some basis. A defector from the intelligence department, Walter Krivitsky, later directly confirmed the rumors as reliable, and although Krivitsky must be trusted very carefully, he was an informed person. This cannot be taken away from him. One way or another, the Berlin process did not bring us much harm. The Paris trial in the case of counterfeit bills of exchange from the Berlin Trade Mission is another matter. An employee of the Trade Mission, Savly Litvinov, with a group of accomplices, fabricated them for £200,000. It was a very decent amount, amounting to 25 million francs. The bills were bought for 200,000 francs by the French businessman Lutz Blondel and presented them to us for payment. The Berlin Trade Mission filed a case against the Litvinov group, but the Paris criminal jury acquitted it, and in February 1930, the bailiff of the civil court of the Seine department seized the property of our Paris Trade Mission worth 31,200,000 francs. On April 2, the chairman of the Paris Commercial Court allowed an inventory of the situation at the Trade Mission to be taken to secure Lutz Blondel's claim. This is where the French press frolicked to its heart's content. I will say right away that this sad story dragged on for 3 years until the same commercial court declared the bills invalid. And so Krestinsky put these two actions on the same level and boasted that the Soviet press reacted much more calmly to the Berlin verdict than to the Paris one. Still would. Schubert simply picked up a clipping from Izvestia and said, "Mr. Krestinsky, it says here that the German government and the prosecutor are responsible for the acquittal. But we were in contact with Brodowski all the time. You know that we did everything in our power and gave directives to the prosecutor, but he insisted on charges and non-application of amnesty. And now your government newspaper allows itself to make statements that contradict reality. How can this be allowed? The appearance of such articles does not promote good relations. We need to reach an agreement once and for all and put an end to the possibility of such articles distorting reality. However, for Litvinov's kid this was just the beginning. And we have to repeat, for many years the usual practice of our Berlin embassy will be a meticulous, capricious search for all the fleas in the German press and inflating these newspaper and other minor incidents to the size of serious interstate complications. The expression newspaper persecution will be the most commonly used in the vocabulary of Soviet diplomats in Berlin. And for the German ambassadors in Moscow, attempts to appeal to the common sense of Litvinov and his deputies will be the same common and unsuccessful practice. It would seem that direct diplomatic contacts with our main trading partner should have economics as their main topic. There were always many subtle, controversial issues and the trade mission could not always deal with them directly.